The fog that morning possessed a peculiar quality, thick as cotton wool, yet somehow luminous, as though London herself had been wrapped in a shroud of pale gold. It was the 13th of October, 1894, and Baker Street, that thoroughfare so familiar to every cabman and constable in the metropolis, had begun to disappear. Not metaphorically, you understand, actually, physically disappear. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore noticed it first as she stepped from her doorway at number 217, her market basket clutched in gloved hands. The brass numbers on her neighbor's door, the Hendersons, at 219, were no longer visible. Indeed, the entire facade of their establishment had taken on a wavering, translucent quality, as if viewed through water. She blinked, attributing the phenomenon to her aging eyes, and hurried toward the corner, where the morning sunlight surely would burn away this troublesome mist. But the fog did not lift. If anything, it thickened. By 8:30, the postman, Mr. Timothy Graves, discovered he could no longer locate number 223. He stood in the street, his leather satchel heavy with letters, staring at what should have been a familiar Georgian townhouse. Instead, there was only fog, dense, impenetrable, and utterly silent. Pause. When he reached forward with a trembling hand, his fingers encountered nothing but cold vapor where brick and mortar should have stood. The alarm was raised shortly thereafter. A constable's whistle pierced the morning air, shrill and insistent. Then another. Within the hour, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood in the middle of Baker Street, his sharp features creased with an expression that managed to convey both irritation and profound unease. "Impossible," he muttered, though the evidence before him suggested otherwise. "Utterly impossible." 6 buildings had vanished, not collapsed, not burned, not demolished, vanished. Numbers 219 through 224 Baker Street, including 3 residential establishments, a tobacconist's shop, a lending library, and most troubling of all, the offices of Crosby and Sons, solicitors, where documents pertaining to some of London's most prominent families were stored. The fog that enveloped these locations possessed qualities that defied natural explanation. It remained precisely contained, forming a wall of vapor that stretched from the cobblestones to well above the roofline. Those brave or foolish enough to venture into it reported a profound disorientation, emerging seconds later several yards from where they had entered, with no memory of what lay within, and a chill that penetrated to their very bones. By noon, Baker Street had become a circus. Crowds pressed against the police barriers, their faces reflecting every emotion from scientific curiosity to superstitious dread. Newspaper reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Street vendors hawked hot chestnuts and meat pies, ever ready to profit from catastrophe. A gentleman in a top hat proclaimed the end of days was upon us, while a woman in widow's weeds simply wept, for her sister had been visiting the lending library that morning and had not emerged. The fog did not smell of London's usual coal smoke and river damp. Those who approached it closely reported a scent both sweet and acrid, like chemicals mixed with something organic and strange flowers, perhaps, or herbs, though none could name which variety. The air around it seemed to shimmer, not with heat but with something else entirely, as though the very fabric of the street had become uncertain. Inspector Lestrade had ordered his men to establish a perimeter, but what good were barriers against fog? It neither advanced nor retreated, simply remained, a vertical wall of mystery in the heart of London's most famous street. "Has anyone attempted to enter since the postman?" asked Sergeant Hopkins, a solid young man with considerable promise but limited imagination. "3 constables and a reporter from the Times," Lestrade replied grimly. All emerged confused and empty-handed. The reporter claimed he walked in a straight line for what felt like hours, yet reappeared behind his starting point within moments. His pocket watch had stopped, and his notepad previously full of scribbling was blank. Hopkins paled slightly. "What do you make of it, sir?" "I make nothing of it," Lestrade snapped, though this was clearly untrue. "What I need is an explanation that doesn't involve magic or phantoms. What I need—" He paused, staring at the impossible fog before him. "What I need is someone whose genius lies in seeing what others cannot." It was at this precise moment that a hansom cab arrived at the police barrier. From it descended a young woman of perhaps 25, her traveling cloak of deep burgundy velvet suggesting both good taste and comfortable means. Her face, framed by dark curls beneath a fashionable hat, bore an expression of determined urgency. "Inspector Lestrade?" she called, her voice clear and educated. Lestrade turned, grateful for any distraction from the inexplicable. "Yes, madam. I'm afraid I must ask you to move along. This area is—" "My uncle is in there," she interrupted, gesturing toward the fog. "Mr. Edmund Crosby, of Crosby and Sons. He arrived at his office at 8 o'clock this morning, as he does every day without fail. He has not emerged." The inspector's expression softened slightly. "I'm terribly sorry, miss, but—" "Miss Crosby, Catherine Crosby." She stepped closer, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. "Inspector, my uncle is a man of rigid habit. He would never simply disappear without word. Moreover, he had an appointment this morning with a client of considerable importance. A matter of inheritance, he told me, involving documents that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands." This caught Lestrade's attention. "What sort of documents?" He would not specify. "Attorney-client privilege, you understand." But he was troubled, Inspector. Deeply troubled. "Privilege, you understand." But he was troubled, Inspector. Deeply troubled. For the past fortnight, he had seemed anxious, looking over his shoulder, starting at sudden noises. She paused, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "3 nights ago, he told me that if anything should happen to him, I was to go immediately to 221B Baker Street and engage the services of Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Pause. Lestrade and Hopkins exchanged glances. "Did he indeed?" murmured the inspector. A complex expression crossed his face, part rivalry, part respect, part relief. "Well, Miss Crosby, I believe your uncle was a very wise man." Hopkins, "Hail that cab before it departs." But Miss Catherine Crosby was already moving, her burgundy cloak billowing behind her as she hurried toward the waiting hansom. "I know the way, Inspector," she called back. "I intend to go there directly." As the cab clattered away down Baker Street, that portion of it which remained visible and solid, Lestrade turned back to the wall of fog. Somewhere within that impossible barrier, 6 buildings stood hidden from view, and with them, who knew how many souls? The inspector pulled his coat tighter against a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. In all his years with Scotland Yard, he had encountered murders most foul, thefts most cunning, and frauds most elaborate. But this was something altogether different. This was impossible. And if there was one man in all of London who specialized in the impossible, it was the consulting detective who resided at 221B Baker Street, or rather, at that portion of Baker Street which, mercifully, remained untouched by whatever strange phenomenon had consumed its neighboring establishments. Music swells. As the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate London's perpetual haze, the fog around the vanished buildings seemed almost to pulse with a life of its own. And deep within its depths, unheard by the crowd or the constables or even the sharp-eared reporters, there came the faintest sound, a clock chiming the hour. But the hour it chimed was not the hour that showed on every other timepiece in London. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street possessed that quality of comfortable disorder that comes only from being inhabited by a mind too restless for conventional tidiness. Books lay open across every surface, their pages marked with torn scraps of newspaper. Chemical apparatus occupied the corner table, releasing the faint scent of sulfur and something sharper, possibly phosphorus. The Persian slipper that served as a tobacco pouch hung from the mantelpiece, while a stack of unanswered correspondence lay pinned to the wooden chimney-piece by a jackknife. I had returned that morning from a medical consultation in Kensington, and found my friend and colleague, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in one of his contemplative moods. He stood by the window, his long, thin frame silhouetted against the filtered London light, violin in hand, though he had not yet drawn the bow across its strings. "You are troubled, Holmes," I observed, settling into my chair and reaching for my pipe. "I am bored, Watson," he replied, though he did not turn from the window. "London has become disappointingly law-abiding of late. 3 days without a case of any interest whatsoever. The mind, my dear fellow, rebels against stagnation. It requires problems to solve as the body requires food to sustain it." I smiled, for I had heard this complaint many times before. Surely there must be some small mystery requiring your attention. A missing heirloom? A coded message? Mrs. Henderson's supposedly stolen brooch was merely misplaced in her sewing basket. I deduced as much without leaving this room. The coded message delivered to me yesterday proved to be nothing more than a grocer's bill rendered illegible by water damage. He sighed, a sound of profound discontent. I am reduced to conducting experiments on tobacco ash. Fascinating in its own right, certainly, but hardly the intellectual stimulation I. He stopped mid-sentence. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, his body tensing like a hound catching a scent. Watson, do you observe anything unusual in the street below? I rose and joined him at the window. Baker Street appeared much as it always did, hansoms passing, pedestrians hurrying about their business, vendors calling their wares. I see nothing out of the ordinary. Precisely, Holmes said softly. Look again at the far end of the street. What do you see? I strained my eyes in that direction. There appears to be a crowd gathered, some sort of commotion perhaps, and is that fog? Fog, yes, but observe its character. It does not drift or dissipate. It remains stationary, Watson, in defiance of every meteorological principle. His gray eyes gleamed with sudden interest. And unless I am much mistaken, that is Inspector Lestrade's distinctive figure among the crowd. Something has occurred, my friend, something that has brought Scotland Yard to our very doorstep. Our doorstep? I echoed, puzzled. A figure of speech, though perhaps more literal than you imagine. The commotion appears to be centered approximately 300 yards from our current position. He turned from the window, animated now in a way he had not been moments before. We shall have visitors shortly, Watson. I suggest you. The sound of rapid footsteps upon the stairs interrupted him. Mrs. Hudson's voice carried up from below, protesting this unseemly haste, followed by a woman's breathless reply. Moments later, our landlady appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with exertion and concern. Mr. Holmes, I do apologize, but this young lady insisted she must see you immediately. She says it's a matter of life and death, came a clear voice from behind her. Miss Catherine Crosby swept into the room with a determination that brooked no obstacle. Her cheeks bore the color of exertion and distress, and her dark eyes fixed upon Holmes with an intensity that spoke of desperation barely held in check. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume? I am he, Holmes replied, his demeanor instantly professional. And you are Miss Crosby, unless I am very much mistaken. Your uncle is Edmund Crosby, solicitor, whose offices stand or stood at 222 Baker Street. You traveled here by hansom from a distance of approximately 300 yards, which suggests unusual urgency given the negligible distance. You are right-handed, unmarried, recently bereaved of your mother, and you possess information regarding a legal matter of considerable sensitivity. The young woman's eyes widened. How could you possibly? Holmes gestured gracefully. The ink stain on your right middle finger indicates your writing hand and suggests you handle documents regularly, perhaps assisting your uncle in his practice. The absence of a wedding ring speaks for itself. Your mourning jewelry is of recent acquisition. The clasp shows nowhere, but you wear a brooch containing a woman's portrait that bears a distinct resemblance to your own features. Your mother, most likely, and recently departed given the freshness of your grief. As for your uncle and his location, Mrs. Hudson mentioned you came from Baker Street, and there is only one solicitor's office in this thoroughfare. The urgency in your manner, combined with what I observed from my window moments ago, allows me to deduce the rest. Miss Crosby stood silent for a moment, then sank into the chair I hastily offered. My uncle warned me you were remarkable, Mr. Holmes. I confess I am both impressed and unnerved. Your uncle spoke of me? Holmes settled into his own chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his characteristic pose when a case began to interest him. He did, sir. 3 nights ago, in fact. He told me that if anything untoward should occur, I was to seek your assistance immediately. She drew a steadying breath. Mr. Holmes, my uncle has vanished, along with his entire office building and 5 other establishments on this very street. I could not contain my astonishment. Vanished? Surely you mean. I could not contain my astonishment. Vanished? Surely you mean. I mean precisely what I say, Dr. Watson. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. The buildings are gone, replaced by a wall of fog that defies all natural explanation. The police are baffled. Inspector Lestrade himself suggested I consult with you. Pause. Holmes leaned forward, his entire being focused on our visitor. Tell me everything, Miss Crosby. Omit no detail, however insignificant it may seem. Begin with your uncle's behavior in recent weeks. She gathered her thoughts, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Uncle Edmund Eswazes, she faltered, then continued more firmly. My uncle is a man of absolute regularity. He rises at 7, breakfasts at 1:30, and arrives at his office at precisely 8 o'clock each morning. He is meticulous in his habits and his professional conduct. For 30 years, he has maintained the practice established by my grandfather. But recently, something changed, Holmes prompted. Yes, it began perhaps a fortnight ago. A new client came to see him, a gentleman who insisted upon absolute privacy. Uncle Edmund dismissed his clerk for the duration of the consultation, which he had never done before. After the gentleman departed, my uncle seemed troubled, distracted. He began locking documents in his private safe rather than leaving them in the office files. He would start at unexpected noises. Once, I came upon him standing at his office window, staring down at the street as though watching for something. Did he mention the nature of this client's business? Only that it pertained to a matter of inheritance documents that must be protected at all costs. He said the family involved was of considerable prominence and that certain parties would go to great lengths to prevent these documents from being properly executed. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Did he name these parties? Numero. But he did say something strange. She paused, as if weighing whether to continue. He said, Catherine, there are those in this city who possess knowledge that was never meant for mortal minds, knowledge that can bend reality itself to their will. I thought he was speaking metaphorically, perhaps about the power of wealth and influence. But now you wonder if he meant something more literal, Holmes finished. Did your uncle have any background in the sciences, chemistry perhaps, or physics? None whatsoever. He was a solicitor, Mr. Holmes, concerned only with contracts and wills and property deeds. Yet someone came to him with documents of sufficient importance to inspire fear. Holmes rose and began to pace, his movements quick and deliberate. Watson, you recall the Netherton case 3 years ago? The industrial chemist who disappeared, I replied. We never did discover what became of him. We did not, though I had my suspicions. Netherton had been conducting experiments with atmospheric phenomena, specifically the manipulation of gaseous substances to create localized effects. The Royal Society dismissed his work as impossible, but I obtained his notes after his disappearance. They suggested theoretical applications that were troubling. Miss Crosby looked between us with growing alarm. Are you suggesting this is the work of some scientific apparatus? That someone has deliberately caused these buildings to vanish? I am suggesting nothing yet, Holmes replied. I am merely assembling possibilities. Tell me, when did you last see your uncle? Yesterday evening. He dined with me at my lodgings in Marylebone. He seemed agitated, but when I pressed him, he said only that all would be resolved within a day or two. He had an appointment scheduled for this morning, an appointment he described as crucial. With whom? He would not say. Only that this person possessed information that would set everything right. Her voice caught. That was the last thing he said to me. Tomorrow, Catherine, everything will be set right. Music swells. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his sharp profile outlined against the window. When he spoke, his voice carried that quality of intense focus that I had learned to recognize as the sign of a mind fully engaged. Miss Crosby, I will take your case. Moreover, I suspect that your uncle's disappearance and the phenomenon currently affecting Baker Street are intimately connected. Watson, fetch your coat and your medical bag. We shall examine this impossible fog for ourselves. You believe someone has done this deliberately? I asked, already moving toward my belongings. I believe, Watson, that impossibility is merely another word for a truth we do not yet understand. 6 buildings do not vanish into thin air without cause, and men like Edmund Crosby do not speak of bending reality unless they have encountered something extraordinary. He turned to Miss Crosby, and his expression softened ever so slightly. Your uncle told you to seek my help should anything occur. That suggests he anticipated this possibility and trusted in my ability to resolve it. I shall endeavor to prove worthy of that trust. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. She rose, hope and fear warring in her features. What should I do? Return to your lodgings and await word from me. If anyone contacts you regarding your uncle or his affairs, send word immediately to this address. Trust no one, Miss Crosby. If someone has gone to the extraordinary lengths of making 6 buildings disappear, they will not hesitate to silence anyone who might interfere with their plans. After Miss Crosby departed escorted by a constable, Holmes insisted upon summoning my friend stood in contemplative silence, his fingers drumming against the mantelpiece. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. "I make nothing of it yet, dear fellow, but I smell purpose in this peculiar affair. Purpose, planning, and a mind of considerable ingenuity." He reached for his coat and scarf. "Come, Watson. Let us see what impossibilities await us on our own doorstep." As we descended the 17 steps to Baker Street, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking towards something far stranger than any case we had encountered before. The fog that had consumed 6 buildings awaited us, and with it, mysteries that might challenge even Sherlock Holmes's legendary powers of deduction. The walk from our door to the edge of the phenomenon took less than 3 minutes, yet in that brief journey, the very character of Baker Street transformed. The familiar sounds of London, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the calls of vendors, the rumble of omnibuses gradually diminished, replaced by an eerie hush that seemed to emanate from the fog itself. Inspector Lestrade stood conferring with Sergeant Hopkins when we arrived. His weathered face showed relief at the sight of Holmes, though his professional pride prevented him from admitting it directly. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted us with a curt nod, "I thought Miss Crosby might persuade you to involve yourself in this situation." "Situation?" Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Is that the official Scotland Yard terminology for the impossible, Lestrade?" "I don't believe in impossibilities, Mr. Holmes. Only in things we haven't yet explained." Despite his words, the inspector's eyes betrayed his unease as he gestured toward the wall of fog. "I've had men trying to penetrate it all morning. No success whatsoever." The fog indeed presented an extraordinary sight. It rose from the street like a solid wall, extending upward beyond the visible roofline and sideways for a precise distance that aligned exactly with the boundaries of the affected buildings. At its edge, the demarcation was so sharp that one could see individual cobblestones disappear into it as cleanly as if cut by a knife. Holmes approached slowly, every sense alert. I observed him employ his singular method of investigation: sight, smell, touch, each faculty brought to bear on the problem with systematic precision. "Remarkable," he murmured, kneeling to examine where fog met stone. "Watson, bring your medical expertise to bear. Describe the qualities of this vapor." I knelt beside him, noting immediately that this was no ordinary London fog. The usual acrid smell of coal smoke was absent. Instead, there was that peculiar scent Miss Crosby had mentioned, sweet yet chemical, organic yet artificial. "The odor suggests some form of botanical compound," I observed, "perhaps mixed with ether or chloroform, though neither quite captures it. Your medical training serves you well." Holmes withdrew a small glass vial from his coat and carefully collected a sample of the fog's edge. "Note how the vapor possesses weight, Watson. Observe." He held his hand just outside the fog's boundary, then slowly moved it forward. I watched in fascination as the fog seemed to resist his movement, not flowing around his fingers as normal vapor would, but rather pressing back against them with discernible pressure. "It has density," I breathed, "like pressing against fabric." "Precisely. This is not mere water vapor, nor even chemically enhanced smoke. This is something altogether more sophisticated." He rose, his eyes alight with intellectual excitement. "Lestrade, has anyone successfully entered and emerged with clear memory of the experience?" "None, sir." 3 constables tried. Each walked in confidently and emerged within moments, confused and disoriented. They described walking in circles, hearing strange sounds, feeling intense cold, but nothing concrete, nothing useful. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I require your medical assessment. These men who entered, did any display physical symptoms?" "I could examine them," I offered. "Please do. I shall conduct further observations here." Lestrade directed me to the 3 constables who had attempted entry. They sat on a nearby bench, looking shaken but otherwise unharmed. I conducted a thorough examination of each man. The first, Constable Weatherby, showed a pulse elevated beyond what simple exertion would explain. His pupils were slightly dilated, and his hands trembled minutely. "It was the strangest thing, Doctor," he told me. "I stepped in, meaning to walk straight through. But there was no through, just fog in every direction. I couldn't see my own feet. And the cold not like winter cold, but something else, like all the warmth being drawn out of me." The second constable reported similar sensations, but added a detail that caught my attention. "I heard sounds, sir. Not from the street, but from somewhere else. Voices, maybe? Or machinery? A sort of humming that made my teeth ache." The third man had the most unsettling account. "Time felt wrong in there, Doctor. I thought I walked for hours, but they tell me I was inside for less than a minute. My pocket watch had stopped at the exact moment I entered, and when I emerged, I found this." He showed me his hand. Across his palm ran a thin red line, not quite a cut, more like a burn. "I touched nothing, sir, nothing at all. But when I came out, this was there." I reported these findings to Holmes, who listened with intense concentration. "Elevated pulse, disorientation, temporal distortion, and unexplained physical marks," he summarized. "Watson, this suggests something beyond mere chemical vapor. This implies a controlled environment, carefully maintained and precisely bounded." "But how?" I asked. "And more importantly, why?" "The how is a question for later investigation. The why," he gazed at the fog with narrowed eyes. "The why relates to whatever documents Edmund Crosby was protecting. Lestrade, I need to know everything about the buildings that have disappeared. Every occupant, every business, every possible connection." The inspector pulled out his notebook. "Number 219 is the Henderson residence, a retired colonel and his wife. Number 220 is Blackwood's tobacco shop. Number 221 is Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's boarding house, currently housing 3 tenants. Number 222 is Crosby and Sons, solicitors. Number 223 is Pemberton's lending library. Number 224 is another residence belonging to a Mr. Samuel Preston, a clerk with the Bank of England." Holmes's fingers tapped rhythmically against his coat. "Diverse establishments with no obvious connection, yet they must be connected, or why take all 6? If the target was merely Crosby's office, why not affect only that building? Perhaps the perpetrator lacked precision?" I suggested. "No, Watson. Observe the boundaries. They are exact to the inch." This required tremendous precision. These other buildings were included deliberately. He began to pace, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Lestrade, I need the names of all persons known to be inside these establishments when the fog descended." Hopkins stepped forward with his own notes. "We've accounted for approximately 15 souls, sir. The Hendersons, Mrs. Whitmore and her 3 tenants, the tobacconist Mr. Blackwood and his apprentice, Mr. Crosby and his clerk, the librarian Miss Charlotte Red and 2 patrons, and Mr. Preston's elderly mother, who lives with him." 15 people, Holmes murmured. 15 lives hanging in the balance. "We must assume they remain alive within whatever space exists beyond this barrier." "You believe there is a space beyond it?" Lestrade asked sharply. "The buildings did not collapse, did not burn, did not sink into the earth. Therefore, they must exist somewhere. The fog is not concealing rubble, Inspector. It is concealing the buildings themselves, somehow transported or displaced." He paused, examining the fog's edge once more. "Or perhaps not transported at all. Perhaps merely separated from our perception of reality." I confess his words sent a chill through me. "Holmes, you're speaking of things that sound more like spiritualism than science, am I?" He turned to me with that penetrating gaze. "Tell me, Watson, when you look through a microscope, do you not see a world invisible to the naked eye? When you study bacteria, are you not observing life that exists alongside our own, unseen and unsuspected by the untrained observer? Why should space itself be any different? Why should there not be layers to reality, separable under the right conditions?" Pause. Before I could respond, a commotion arose from the crowd. A woman had broken through the police barrier and was running toward the fog, her gray hair streaming behind her, her face contorted with desperation. "My sister!" she cried. "Charlotte! Charlotte, can you hear me?" Two constables moved to intercept her, but Holmes raised his hand sharply. "Let her approach." The woman whom I took to be the sister of Miss Charlotte read. The librarian stopped at the fog's edge, calling frantically into its depths. "Charlotte, please, if you can hear me." We all stood silent, listening, and then, impossibly, we heard a response. Faint, muffled, as if coming from a great distance, a woman's voice drifted out from the fog. "Helen, Helen, is that you?" "I'm here." "We're all here, but we can't find the way out. The streets keep changing, and—" The voice cut off abruptly, swallowed by that unearthly silence. Music swells. Helen Reed collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Lestrade and Hopkins rushed to support her, but Holmes remained fixed on the fog, his expression intense. "They are alive," he said quietly. "The buildings exist, and their occupants survive. But they are trapped in some form of spatial distortion, a labyrinth created by whatever mechanism generates this fog." He spun toward Lestrade. "I need access to Crosby's client records, whatever files exist outside his office. And I need them immediately." "On what grounds?" Lestrade demanded. "On the grounds that 15 innocent people are imprisoned in an impossible maze, and the key to releasing them lies in understanding why Edmund Crosby was targeted." Holmes's voice rang with authority. "This is not random, Inspector. This is calculated, purposeful, and incredibly dangerous. Whoever has done this possesses knowledge and resources far beyond the ordinary criminal mind." Lestrade hesitated only a moment. "Hopkins, accompany Mr. Holmes to wherever he needs to go." Full cooperation. As we prepared to depart, Holmes took one last long look at the fog. "We will find them, Watson," he said softly, "but we must work quickly. Whoever created this has gone to extraordinary lengths to imprison these people and secure whatever secrets Crosby possessed. Such a person will not stop at mere imprisonment if their aims are threatened. You believe they're in danger?" "I believe, my dear fellow, that we have stumbled upon something far larger than a simple disappearance. This fog is not an end in itself, it is a means. And until we understand to what end it serves, every soul trapped within it remains in mortal peril." As we walked back toward our lodgings to collect materials for our investigation, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at that impossible wall of vapor. Somewhere within its depths, 15 people waited for rescue, trapped between the real world and something altogether stranger. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot. Edmund Crosby's residence in Marylebone proved to be a neat Georgian townhouse with black railings and window boxes that, despite the season, still bore late-blooming chrysanthemums. Miss Catherine Crosby met us at the door, her face brightening with hope at the sight of Holmes. "Have you discovered something?" she asked eagerly. "We have confirmed that the victims survive within the affected area," Holmes replied. "Beyond that, I require access to your uncle's private Paperzini documents he may have kept here rather than at his office." She led us to a first-floor study that clearly served as her uncle's sanctuary from the demands of his profession. The room smelled pleasantly of leather and tobacco, with just a hint of the lavender water the elderly often favor. Legal journals lined the shelves, but Holmes's attention fixed immediately upon a small mahogany desk in the corner. "Does your uncle keep this desk locked?" he asked. "Always. He is most particular about it." She produced a key from a chain at her waist. "He gave me this for emergencies. I suppose this qualifies." Within the desk's drawers, Holmes found precisely what he sought: a separate ledger, smaller than those kept at the office, containing entries written in a cramped, cautious hand. "Clients whose affairs required additional discretion," Holmes murmured, scanning the pages. "Watson, note these names: Lord Ashworth, matter of disputed inheritance; Lady Pemberton, property settlement; Sir Charles Grayson." He stopped, his finger resting on one particular entry. "What is it, Holmes?" "An entry from 3 weeks ago. Meeting with VM regarding the Ravenswood documents. Client extremely agitated. Spoke of dangerous knowledge and family obligations. Retained documents in private safe, office location deemed insufficiently secure." He looked up at Miss Crosby. "Who is VM?" She shook her head. "I don't know." Uncle Edmund used initials in his private records to protect client confidentiality. "The Ravenswood documents," Holmes repeated. "Miss Crosby, does that name mean anything to you?" "The Ravenswood family?" She considered carefully. "They're old aristocracy, aren't they?" "I believe their estate is somewhere in Yorkshire. but I thought the line had died out, perhaps not as thoroughly as supposed. Holmes continued reading. 3 days after that meeting, another entry. VM insists documents must be properly witnessed and filed. Claims rival claimant is desperate to prevent legitimization. Mentioned Professor Marcus Aldrich as potential threat. He looked at Sergeant Hopkins. I need everything you can find on Professor Marcus Aldrich within the hour. What sort of professor, sir? Start with the universities. Chemistry, physics, any field involving experimental science. As Hopkins departed on his errand, Holmes turned to Miss Crosby with unexpected gentleness. I must ask you something of a personal nature. Did your uncle ever speak of feeling threatened, of being followed or watched? He did, actually. About a week ago, he mentioned seeing the same man on 3 consecutive days, once outside his office, once near his club, and once on this very street. A tall man with distinguished features and silver hair, Uncle Edmund said. He carried himself like a gentleman but had eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Did your uncle confront this man? Numero. He said the man always disappeared before he could approach him. Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. Watson, does that description remind you of anyone? It could fit half the distinguished gentlemen in London, I replied, though something about it did tug at my memory. True, but combined with Professor Aldrich's name, he trailed off, lost in thought. We were interrupted by the return of Sergeant Hopkins, slightly breathless from his haste. Found him, Mr. Holmes. Professor Marcus Aldrich, formerly of the Royal College of Science. Brilliant chemist, by all accounts, but dismissed from his position 5 years ago, following accusations of conducting dangerous experiments. He published several papers on what he called atmospheric manipulation methods of altering gaseous densities to create localized phenomena. Pause. Netherton's work, I breathed. Holmes, you mentioned him earlier. Pause. Netherton's work, I breathed. Holmes, you mentioned him earlier. Indeed. Aldrich and Netherton were colleagues before Netherton's disappearance. I begin to see the outlines of a pattern, Watson. He stood abruptly. Hopkins, where does Professor Aldrich currently reside? That's the thing, sir. No one seems to know. He disappeared from his lodgings about 6 months ago, left no forwarding address. But I did find something interesting. His laboratory equipment was sold at auction 3 months back. Purchased by an anonymous buyer through a solicitor's office. Let me guess, Holmes said dryly. Crosby and Sons. Hopkins's eyes widened. How did you guess, sir? That's exactly right. Holmes began pacing, his movements quick and agitated. So we have Aldrich, a disgraced scientist with knowledge of atmospheric manipulation. We have Netherton's work, which explored similar territory. We have the mysterious VM and documents related to the Ravenswood family. And we have Edmund Crosby, the connection between all these threads, now imprisoned within an impossible fog alongside 14 others. But what does the Ravenswood inheritance have to do with scientific experiments? I asked. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must discover. He turned to Miss Crosby. These Ravenswood documents your uncle mentioned, did he keep any copies here? She shook her head. He said they were too sensitive. He stored them in his office safe, which is currently inaccessible within the fog. Holmes's expression grew grim. Someone wants those documents badly enough to imprison 15 people and deploy scientific methods that shouldn't exist. Someone who knew Edmund Crosby possessed them and knew when he would be in his office. This was not random, Miss Crosby. This was precisely targeted. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. A maid entered, looking flustered. Begging your pardon, miss, but there's a gentleman downstairs insisting he must speak with you. He says it's about your uncle and it can't wait. Did he give his name? Holmes asked sharply. Yes, sir. Mr. Vincent Merrick. He says he's a client of Mr. Crosby's. Holmes and I locked eyes. VM, we said simultaneously. Show him up, Holmes instructed. And Hopkins, position yourself by the window. I want no surprises. Vincent Merrick proved to be a man of perhaps 40 years, with the bearing of old wealth and the weariness of new troubles. His features were finely carved, his clothing expensive but understated. When he entered, his eyes immediately found Miss Crosby. Miss Crosby, I came as soon as I heard. Your uncle, is it true? The buildings have actually vanished? It's true, Mr. Merrick, she replied quietly. And you are? Forgive me. Vincent Merrick, at your service. Your uncle has been handling a rather delicate matter for my family. His gaze shifted to Holmes. "And you are Sherlock Holmes?" "I have been engaged to investigate this extraordinary affair." Holmes's tone was courteous but cool. "Mr. Merrick, I believe you recently consulted with Edmund Crosby regarding documents pertaining to the Ravenswood estate." Merrick's composure flickered. "That is a confidential legal matter, Mr. Holmes. Confidentiality becomes less relevant when 15 people are trapped in an impossible prison, sir. I suggest you speak plainly. What is the nature of these documents?" For a long moment, Merrick seemed to debate with himself. Finally, he sighed. "Very well. The matter will become public soon enough he paused, if we cannot recover those documents." He settled into a chair, his hands clasped tightly. "The Ravenswood family was once among the most prominent in England. My grandmother was a Ravenswood, the last legitimate heir, or so everyone believed. When her brother died without issue 30 years ago, the estate passed into a trust, the fortune slowly dissipating through legal fees and mismanagement. But something changed," Holmes prompted. "6 months ago, I was contacted by a man claiming to be the rightful heir to the Ravenswood name and fortune. He possessed documents, birth certificates, marriage records, even a will proving that my great-uncle had in fact married secretly and produced a son. If authentic, these documents would make this claimant the true Ravenswood heir, entitled to everything the trust still controls, which, I might add, still amounts to a considerable sum." "And you sought Edmund Crosby's expertise to verify these documents," Holmes concluded. "I did. Your uncle, Miss Crosby, was renowned for his discretion and his knowledge of inheritance law. He agreed to examine the documents and file them with the appropriate courts if he deemed them genuine." "And did he?" I asked. Merrick's expression darkened. "He did. 3 weeks ago, he informed me that the documents appeared authentic. He planned to file them with the courts this week, which would initiate proceedings to transfer the Ravenswood estate to its rightful heir." "Thereby disinheriting you," Holmes observed. "Thereby restoring justice," Merrick corrected firmly. "I am not a man who would claim what is not rightfully mine, Mr. Holmes. If this man is truly the Ravenswood heir, he deserves his inheritance." Music swells. Holmes studied Merrick with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through mere words to the truth beneath. "A noble sentiment, Mr. Merrick. Yet you must understand how this appears. You stood to inherit a fortune. Now you face losing it to a previously unknown claimant. The documents that prove his claim are conveniently trapped beyond reach. Some might find that timing convenient." Merrick's face flushed with anger. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this impossibility in Baker Street?" "I am suggesting nothing. I am merely observing facts and drawing logical inferences." Holmes's tone remained maddeningly calm. "Tell me, Mr. Merrick, where were you this morning between the hours of 6 and 9? "I was at my club, the Athenaeum, where I stayed last night. I breakfasted in the dining room at 8 and remained until nearly 11, at which point I heard the news about Baker Street." His voice shook with indignation. "I have witnesses, Mr. Holmes. More than a dozen gentlemen can attest to my presence." "Then you have nothing to fear from my inquiries." Holmes rose, signaling the interview's conclusion. "However, I must ask, who is this mysterious claimant? What is his name?" "He calls himself Richard Ravenswood." Merrick stood as well, his composure returning. "Though Edmund Crosby suspected that was an assumed name, his real identity remains unclear." "And where might we find Mr. Richard Ravenswood?" "I don't know. He communicated with Mr. Crosby directly, never through me. I never actually met the man." Merrick moved toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Holmes, despite your implications, I want those documents found and properly filed. I want my uncle's name cleared and the rightful heir installed. Find Edmund Crosby, sir, and find the truth." After Merrick departed, Hopkins let out a low whistle. "What do you make of him, Mr. Holmes?" "I make nothing of him yet," Holmes replied, but his eyes were distant, calculating. "Watson, did you observe his hands?" "I confess I did not pay particular attention. No traces of chemical stains, no unusual calluses. Either he is innocent of creating that fog, or he employed someone else to do his work for him." He turned to Miss Crosby. "Has anyone else contacted you about your uncle's affairs?" "No one except—" She stopped, remembering. "Wait. Yesterday, a telegram arrived for Uncle Edmund. I collected his correspondence as I usually do, intending to bring it to him this morning. It's still in my bag." She retrieved a cream-colored envelope from her handbag. Holmes seized it eagerly, examining both envelope and contents with his characteristic intensity. "No return address. Posted yesterday afternoon from the Strand," he read aloud. "The documents must not be filed. You have until Thursday to reconsider. A concerned party." He lowered the telegram, his expression grave. "Today is Thursday, Watson." A chill ran through me. "You think this is connected?" "I think the timing is far too precise to be coincidental. Someone wanted to prevent those documents from being filed. Someone willing to go to extraordinary lengths to ensure Edmund Crosby could not fulfill his professional obligation." He held the telegram up to the light. "The paper is of good quality, the handwriting educated, possibly that of a professional clerk. The phrase concerned party suggests someone with legal knowledge. Another solicitor?" Hopkins suggested. "Possibly. Or someone familiar with legal proceedings." Holmes began pacing again, that restless energy building. "We have too many threads and not enough connections. Vincent Merrick, who stands to lose a fortune. Richard Ravenswood, who stands to gain one. Professor Marcus Aldrich, who possesses the scientific knowledge to create an impossible fog. And somewhere, lurking behind all of this, someone willing to imprison 15 innocent people to protect what? A secret? A fortune? Something else entirely?" "What's our next move?" I asked. Holmes stopped at the window, gazing out at the London afternoon. "We need to find Professor Aldrich, and we need to discover the true identity of Richard Ravenswood. Both men are shadows at present, names without substance. But shadows can be illuminated, Watson. Shadows can be chased into the light." He turned back to face us, his features set with determination. "Hopkins, I need you to trace every transaction related to the purchase of Aldrich's laboratory equipment. Someone bought it, someone transported it, someone is using it. Find that thread and pull it. Miss Crosby, you must recall everything your uncle ever mentioned about this Ravenswood claimant. Every detail, no matter how small." "And us?" I inquired. "We, my dear Watson, are going to visit the Royal College of Science. Professor Aldrich may have left his position, but academics are notorious record keepers. Someone there will remember him, and someone will know where he's gone." As we prepared to depart, I couldn't shake the image of Vincent Merrick's face when he spoke of the Ravenswood inheritance. He had seemed genuinely willing to surrender his claim, genuinely interested in justice being served. But Sherlock Holmes had taught me long ago that seeming and being are often two very different things. And in a case involving impossible fog and vanishing buildings, nothing could be taken at face value. The first suspect had emerged. But whether he was truly guilty or merely another victim in a larger game remained to be seen. The Royal College of Science occupied an imposing Gothic structure in South Kensington, its gray stone facade weathered by decades of London rain and soot. Holmes and I presented ourselves at the porter's lodge, where a wizened gentleman with spectacles perched on the end of his nose examined us with the suspicion endemic to institutional gatekeepers. "Professor Aldrich, you say?" The porter's face twisted into an expression of distaste. "Haven't heard that name spoken in these halls for years, and good riddance." "You remember him, then?" Holmes inquired. "Remember him?" "Sir, one doesn't forget a man who nearly burned down the chemistry laboratory and put 3 students in hospital." The porter leaned forward conspirationally. "Brilliant," they said. "But brilliance and madness often share the same room, if you take my meaning." "I take it very clearly." "Is there anyone currently on staff who worked with Aldrich? Someone who might provide insights into his work and whereabouts?" "Dr. Pemberton in the chemistry department knew him well. Too well, some might say. They were colleagues before everything went wrong. We found Dr. Elias Pemberton in a laboratory that smelled strongly of sulfur and something else something organic and faintly sweet that reminded me unpleasantly of the fog in Baker Street. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, his once dark hair now liberally streaked with silver, his fingers stained with the marks of his profession." When Holmes introduced himself, Pemberton's expression shifted from curiosity to wariness. "The consulting detective? I've read of your exploits in the newspapers, Mr. Holmes. What brings you to our modest establishment?" "Professor Marcus Aldrich," Holmes replied simply. The effect was immediate. Pemberton's face paled, and he carefully set down the test. and he carefully set down the test tube he'd been holding. "I haven't spoken to Marcus in 5 years, not since his dismissal. Yet you were colleagues. Friends, perhaps?" "We were." Pemberton's voice carried the weight of old regret. "Marcus was the most gifted chemist I'd ever encountered. His understanding of molecular structures, of gaseous behaviors, it bordered on the uncanny. But he became obsessed with atmospheric manipulation." Pemberton's eyes widened. "You know of his work?" "I know enough to understand it may be relevant to a current investigation. Dr. Pemberton, has Aldrich contacted you recently?" "Numero. As I said, we haven't spoken in." "The truth, if you please." Holmes's voice carried an edge now. "I am investigating the disappearance of 6 buildings from Baker Street, buildings that have been enveloped in fog possessing qualities remarkably consistent with Aldrich's theoretical work. 15 people are trapped within that fog, Doctor. Their lives may depend on your candor." Pause. Pemberton sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "He wrote to me," he admitted quietly, "3 months ago. He wanted to know if I still had our early research notes, the experiments we conducted before the college put a stop to them." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd burned them years ago." Which was true. Pemberton met Holmes's gaze directly. "Mr. Holmes, when the college dismissed Marcus, I thought it was the end of everything. Our work, our friendship, our shared dreams of advancing science. But in the years since, I've come to believe they were right to stop us. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue." "What exactly were you researching?" I asked. "We called it selective density manipulation. The theory was that by altering the molecular density of air in a confined space, one could create barriers invisible to the eye but impermeable to physical passage. Imagine, gentlemen, walls of air, structures of pure atmosphere." The applications seemed limitless. "But something went wrong," Holmes surmised. "Several things went wrong. The chemicals required proved highly unstable. The boundaries of the density fields were difficult to control. And most troubling of all, the fields seemed to create anomalies." "What sort of anomalies?" Pemberton rose and moved to a cabinet from which he withdrew a leather-bound journal. "I kept this, though I told Marcus I'd destroyed it. My own notes from our experiments. Here." He opened to a page covered in dense handwriting and diagrams. "Our 5th test. We successfully created a barrier of dense air approximately 6 feet in diameter, solid to the touch, invisible to the eye. But objects placed within the field began exhibiting strange properties. A pocket watch stopped functioning, a compass spun wildly, and a candle placed at the field center burned with a blue flame and consumed wax at 1/10 the normal rate. As if time itself moved differently within the field," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with fascination. "That was Marcus's interpretation. He became convinced we'd stumbled upon something far more significant than simple atmospheric barriers. He believed we'd found a way to create what he called pocket dimension spaces that existed alongside our reality, but operated according to different physical laws." I felt a cold sensation creeping down my spine. "That's impossible, is it, Dr. Watson?" Pemberton's smile was sad. 5 years ago, I would have agreed with you. Now I'm not so certain. The universe, I've learned, is far stranger than our philosophies allow for." Holmes had been studying the journal intently. "These formulas, they require specialized equipment and rare chemicals. Where would Aldrich obtain such materials?" "I don't know. After his dismissal, he vanished from academic circles entirely. But Mr. Holmes, if Marcus has indeed created a functional density field on the scale you describe, 6 entire buildings, the amount of energy required would be staggering. And the instability—" "Go on." "Our largest successful field was barely 6 feet across, and it lasted only 20 minutes before collapsing catastrophically. The chemical reaction consumed itself, and the field imploded with considerable force. Imagine that on the scale of 6 buildings, Mr. Holmes. If the field fails," he trailed off, his meaning clear. "The structures could be destroyed," I breathed, "and everyone inside them, or worse." Pemberton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The collapse of a field that large could create a vacuum effect, a sudden implosion that would take everything nearby into it. Buildings, people, everything within a considerable radius." Holmes closed the journal carefully. "How long can such a field be maintained?" "Based on our experiments, no more than a few hours at most. But Marcus always believed he could improve the stability, extend the duration. If he's had 5 years to refine his methods, Pemberton shook his head. I can't say with certainty. Days, perhaps. A week at the outside. But Mr. Holmes, maintaining such a field would require constant attention, constant adjustment of the chemical balance. One error, one miscalculation, and music swells. We emerged from the college into the gathering afternoon, my mind reeling from the implications of Pemberton's revelations. Holmes, I said urgently, if what he says is true, those people don't just need rescue there in immediate danger. If this field collapses, then we must ensure it doesn't collapse before we've evacuated the victims. Holmes's face was set in grim determination. But Watson, consider what we've learned. This field requires constant maintenance, sophisticated equipment, and considerable expertise. Aldrich didn't create this as a simple criminal act. This is precision work, carefully planned and meticulously executed. But why? What could be worth such risk? Documents, Watson. The Ravenswood documents that Edmund Crosby possessed. Someone wants them badly enough to imprison 15 people in an unstable pocket dimension. Someone with access to Aldrich or his knowledge, with resources sufficient to procure rare chemicals and equipment, and with a motive powerful enough to justify mass kidnapping. We had hailed a cab and were directing the driver back to Baker Street when Hopkins came running up, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. Mr. Holmes, thank God I found you. You must come immediately. What's happened? The fog, sir. It's changing. We arrived at the barrier to find the crowd grown considerably since our departure, and Hopkins was right, the fog had altered. Where before it had been uniformly pale, now darker patches swirled within it like ink dropped in water. And the sounds, several people in the crowd reported hearing things from within the fog, voices calling out, the crash of breaking glass. And most disturbing of all, a deep, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate in one's chest. Holmes pushed through to the barrier's edge, his face intense with concentration. He withdrew his pocket watch, noting the time, then reached forward to touch the fog. The density is fluctuating, he said. Feel here, Watson. I placed my hand near the fog's edge and immediately understood what he meant. The resistance I'd felt earlier was no longer constant. Instead, it pulsed, now solid, now yielding, now solid again, in a rhythm like a heartbeat. The field is destabilizing, Holmes concluded. Just as Pemberton predicted. We have less time than I hoped. Lestrade appeared at his elbow. Mr. Holmes, we can't wait any longer. I'm going to send men in with ropes, see if we can establish some kind of path through the fog. That would be unwise, Inspector. The temporal distortions alone could. He was interrupted by The temporal distortions alone could. He was interrupted by a scream from the crowd. A young woman was pointing at the fog, her face white with terror. There! Do you see it? There's someone in there. We all turned to look. And indeed, through the swirling fog, a figure had become briefly visible, a woman's silhouette, pressing against the barrier from the inside, her mouth open in a silent scream. Charlotte! Helen Reed cried out. Charlotte, we can see you. The figure moved closer to the edge, becoming clearer. It was indeed a woman, her dress torn, her hair disheveled. She seemed to be shouting something, but no sound emerged. Then she pointed urgently behind her, deeper into the fog, her expression one of abject terror. And then she vanished again, swallowed by the mist. What did she see? I wondered aloud. What's happening in there? Holmes's jaw was set tight. Something has changed within the field. Some new threat has emerged. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I need access to the property records for all 6 buildings immediately. And I need a map of the underground passages in this area, sewers, tunnels, anything that might run beneath these locations. You think there's a way in through below? I think we've been looking at this problem from the wrong angle. We cannot penetrate the fog from without. But what if there's a way to reach the buildings from within? As Lestrade dispatched Hopkins to obtain the necessary documents, a gentleman pushed through the crowd, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to take in everything at a glance. He approached Holmes directly. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume? You have the advantage of me, sir. My name is Richard Ravenswood, and I believe we need to talk about why someone wants me dead. Pause. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of his surprise. "Indeed, Mr. Ravenswood? Then by all means, let us talk. Watson, find us somewhere private. There's a tea shop just there." I pointed to a small establishment that had remained open despite or perhaps because of the commotion. Inside, away from the crowd's noise, Richard Ravenswood presented his credentials, a birth certificate, several letters, and a photograph of a young couple whom he identified as his parents. "My father was Thomas Ravenswood, eldest son of the Earl of Ravenswood," he explained. "But he married my mother against his family's wishes. She was merely a vicar's daughter, you see. They disowned him, claimed he'd died abroad. My mother and I lived quietly in Cornwall, surviving on what little my father had managed to save. When she passed 3 years ago, I discovered papers she'd kept hidden. Papers proving my father's identity and my claim to the Ravenswood name. And you engaged Edmund Crosby to validate these documents," Holmes prompted. "I did. He verified their authenticity and agreed to file them with the courts. But someone doesn't want that to happen, Mr. Holmes. 2 weeks ago, someone broke into my lodgings. Nothing was taken, but my papers were disturbed. Then 3 days ago, I was followed through the streets by a man. I never saw his face clearly, but I felt his presence, and yesterday I received this." He produced a letter, which Holmes examined carefully. "Withdraw your claim or face the consequences," Holmes read aloud. "No signature, posted from the Strand, similar to the threatening message sent to Crosby." He looked up at Ravenswood. "Yet you did not withdraw." "I will not be intimidated out of what is rightfully mine. My father suffered enough at his family's hands. I won't let them erase his existence, or mine, from history. A noble sentiment. But tell me, Mr. Ravenswood, where were you this morning between 6 and 9 o'clock? Ravenswood's eyes flashed with understanding. "You suspect me? Of creating this impossibility? I suspect everyone until proven otherwise. It's a professional habit. I was at my lodgings in Bloomsbury, sleeping until nearly 8. My landlady, Mrs. Peters, brought breakfast to my room at 1:30. She can confirm my presence." Holmes nodded slowly. "And what brings you here now?" "When I heard what had happened, that Crosby's office had vanished, I knew immediately it was connected to my case. The documents proving my claim are in his office safe, Mr. Holmes. If they're destroyed, your claim dies with them," Holmes finished. "How convenient for those who wish to prevent your inheritance." "Convenient for Vincent Merrick, you mean?" Ravenswood's voice hardened. "I've never met the man, but I know he stands to lose everything if my claim succeeds. He has motive, Mr. Holmes. And from what I've learned, he has resources sufficient to hire whatever expertise might be needed to create such a phenomenon. Yet Merrick claims to be willing to surrender his claim if yours proves legitimate." "He would say that, wouldn't he? But actions speak louder than words. Someone has imprisoned 15 people to prevent those documents from being filed. Someone with much to lose." Holmes rose, his decision made. "Gentlemen, we are no closer to the truth, but we are drowning in suspects. Merrick, who stands to lose a fortune. Ravenswood, who stands to gain one. Aldrich, who possesses the scientific knowledge. And perhaps others we haven't yet identified." He fixed both of us with that penetrating stare. "Watson, we return to Baker Street. I have research to conduct." As we prepared to leave, a commotion arose from the street outside. We rushed out to find the fog had changed again. Its boundaries had shifted, extending several feet further into the street. The field was growing. And if Pemberton's warnings were accurate, its growth meant its collapse was drawing closer. We had hours, perhaps less, to solve this mystery and save 15 innocent lives. The game had entered its critical phase. But which player would make the next move? Evening had settled over London like a shroud by the time Holmes and I returned to 221B Baker Street. The fog around the vanished buildings had taken on an eerie luminescence in the gathering darkness, as though lit from within by some unnatural phosphorescence. Constables with lanterns stood guard at the barriers, but their light seemed feeble against that strange, pulsing glow. Mrs. Hudson had laid out a cold supper, but Holmes barely touched his food. Instead, he had arranged every scrap of evidence across our sitting room: documents, notes, maps, chemical samples, creating what he called his mental palace made visible. "Talk me through it, Watson." he said, pacing before the evidence like a general surveying a battlefield. What do we know with certainty? I consulted my notes. 6 buildings vanished this morning, enveloped in fog created by some form of atmospheric density manipulation. The technology is based on research conducted by Professor Marcus Aldridge and Dr. Pemberton. 15 people are trapped inside, including Edmund Crosby, who possessed documents proving Richard Ravenswood's claim to a substantial inheritance, documents that Vincent Merrick would prefer remained unfiled. Good. Continue. Aldridge was dismissed from the Royal College 5 years ago and has since disappeared. His laboratory equipment was purchased through Crosby's office 3 months ago by an anonymous buyer. Both Crosby and Ravenswood received threatening letters warning them to withdraw from the inheritance matter. The fog is destabilizing and may collapse catastrophically at any time. Holmes stopped pacing. Now tell me what troubles you about this sequence of events. I considered carefully. The scale of it troubles me. To create a field encompassing 6 buildings requires tremendous resources, expertise, and planning. Yet the motive appears to be a simple inheritance dispute. It seems disproportionate. Excellent, Watson. You've identified the central paradox of this case. Holmes picked up the map Lestrade had provided, spreading it across the table. Look here. These are the underground passages beneath Baker Street sewers, old cellars, abandoned tunnels from the original building foundations. And here, he pointed to a specific location. A tunnel that connects several of these buildings, installed decades ago as part of a failed pneumatic railway scheme. You think someone is using these tunnels? I think they provide the only viable route into the affected area. The fog barrier is impassable from the street level, but underground, he trailed off, his eyes gleaming. Watson, fetch your warmest coat and your revolver. We're going into the sewers. Now? In the dark? Especially in the dark. If someone is indeed using these passages to access the buildings, they'll do so under cover of night. We must catch them in the act. 20 minutes later, we stood at the entrance to an old sewer access point 3 streets away from the affected area. Inspector Lestrade had provided us with a key and a warning the passages below were treacherous, and men had been lost in them before. Holmes carried a dark lantern, its beam cutting through the darkness as we descended iron rungs into the tunnel below. The air was cold and damp, carrying the distinctive smell of old water and decaying brick. Our footsteps echoed in the confined space, and I could hear water trickling somewhere in the darkness ahead. According to the map, Holmes whispered, his voice eerily amplified by the tunnel's acoustics, we should reach a junction in approximately 50 yards. From there, one passage leads toward the foundations of number 222 Crosby's office. We moved forward carefully, the lantern's beam revealing brick walls slick with moisture and ancient mortar crumbling from age. The passage was barely wide enough for a man to walk upright, and I found myself grateful for my military training I'd endured worse conditions in Afghanistan, though never in the heart of London. The junction Holmes had mentioned appeared precisely where he'd predicted. 5 passages branched off in different directions, and here we encountered our first significant find fresh bootprints in the accumulated mud, leading toward the passage Holmes had identified as connecting to Crosby's building. Someone has been here recently, I observed unnecessarily. Within the past several hours, Holmes knelt to examine the prints more closely. A man's boots, well made, size 9 or 10. Note the distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. This individual walks with a slight limp, favoring his right leg. He rose, following the prints with his lantern. Come, Watson. But quietly now, we may not be alone down here. We had proceeded perhaps 30 yards when Holmes suddenly raised his hand, signaling me to stop. He extinguished the lantern, plunging us into absolute darkness. Someone ahead! He breathed directly into my ear. I saw a light. We stood motionless, our eyes gradually adjusting. And yes, there, perhaps 50 feet ahead, a faint glow reflected off the tunnel walls. Not steady like a lantern, but flickering, inconstant. Holmes moved forward with extraordinary silence, and I followed as best I could. The light grew brighter as we approached, and I could hear sounds now mechanical clicking, the hiss of chemicals, and someone muttering to themselves in a low voice. We rounded a bend in the tunnel and found ourselves looking into a small chamber, likely an old junction room from the Victorian era. And there, illuminated by several chemical lamps, stood Professor Marcus Aldrich. I recognized him from Pemberton's description, tall, silver-haired, with those penetrating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was bent over a complex apparatus of glass tubes, brass fittings, and bubbling liquids that emitted that same sweet chemical smell I'd noticed in the fog. But he was not alone. Pause. A second figure stood in the shadows beyond the apparatus, someone whose features I couldn't quite make out in the dim, flickering light. They were speaking in low tones, though I could only catch fragments of their conversation. "The field is destabilizing faster than expected," Aldrich was saying. "How long do we have?" the other person asked. The voice was cultured, educated, but I couldn't determine if it belonged to a man or woman. 12 hours at most. After that, the collapse becomes inevitable. Everyone inside will be—" Aldrich paused. "Well, it won't be pleasant. Then we must retrieve the documents tonight. You're certain they remain intact within the field?" "The field preserves everything within it. The documents are safe, assuming we can reach them before the collapse." Holmes chose that moment to step forward into the light, his revolver drawn. "Good evening, Professor Aldrich. I believe we should have a conversation about your recent scientific endeavors." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Aldrich spun toward us, his face registering shock. But it was the other figure who concerned me more. They moved with sudden violence, knocking over one of the chemical lamps and plunging half the chamber into darkness. "Watson, the shadow!" Holmes shouted, but the figure was already gone, disappearing into a side passage I hadn't noticed before. I made to follow, but Holmes grabbed my arm. "Let them go. We have the architect of this disaster. That will suffice." Aldrich had backed against the wall, his hands raised. In the lamplight, I could see his face clearly, now gaunt, exhausted, with the look of a man who had pushed himself beyond all reasonable limits. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Logic, Professor. Your research pointed here, your equipment purchases led here, and the tunnels provided the obvious access route." Holmes kept his revolver trained steadily. "Who was your companion?" "I won't tell you that." "Then tell me this: why? Why imprison 15 innocent people in an unstable dimensional field? What documents could possibly be worth such risk?" Aldrich's laugh was bitter. "Documents? You think this is about inheritance papers and legal proceedings? Mr. Holmes, you understand nothing." "Then enlighten me." For a long moment, Aldrich seemed to debate with himself. Then, perhaps realizing his situation was hopeless, he sank onto a crate and began to speak. 5 years ago, when the college dismissed me, I thought my life was over. My work, my research, my dreams all destroyed by small-minded administrators who couldn't see beyond their own limitations. But then I was contacted by someone who understood. Someone who saw the potential in my research and was willing to fund its completion. "The person who just fled?" I asked. "Yes. They provided everything I needed: equipment, materials, a laboratory hidden from prying eyes. In exchange, I was to perfect my density field technology for a specific purpose." "What purpose?" "To create a secure vault. A space sealed off from the rest of reality, accessible only through the proper chemical key. A place where valuable items could be stored with absolute security. No thief could reach them. No fire could destroy them. No court order could force their disclosure." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "But something went wrong." "Everything went wrong." Aldrich's composure cracked. "The field was supposed to be stable for weeks, but the scaling up introduced variables we hadn't accounted for. And then we discovered that Crosby had scheduled the document filing for today. There was no time for proper testing, no time to refine the process. We had to activate the field immediately to prevent those documents from reaching the courts. So you imprisoned 15 people on the basis of an untested theory. We didn't mean to trap anyone." Aldrich's face was anguished. "The field was supposed to activate at 6 in the morning, before anyone arrived at their offices. But something delayed a chemical reaction that took longer than calculated. By the time the field formed, people were already inside the buildings. And now those people are trapped in a collapsing pocket dimension that may destroy them utterly when it fails," Holmes said coldly. "Your brilliance, Professor, has created a potential massacre." "I know," Aldrich buried his face in his hands. God help me, I know. I've been trying to stabilize the field, but without proper equipment, without my full laboratory. He looked up, and his eyes were wet. Mr. Holmes, you must believe me. I never wanted anyone hurt. I'm a scientist, not a murderer. Yet murder is precisely what you may accomplish. Holmes lowered his revolver slightly. How do we stop the collapse? There's only one way. The field is maintained by a central generator A device I constructed and placed beneath Crosby's office in the old cellars. If we can reach it, I can introduce a decaying agent that will slowly dissolve the field rather than letting it collapse catastrophically. The buildings will gradually become visible again, the barrier will fade, and everyone inside can simply walk out. And if we cannot reach this generator, Aldrich's silence was answer enough. Music swells. Holmes holstered his revolver and began examining Aldrich's apparatus. This equipment, you use it to monitor the field from here? And to make minor adjustments, yes. But the main controls are with the generator. Can you guide us through the tunnels to reach it? I can try, but Mr. Holmes, the tunnels near the field are dangerous. The dimensional distortion affects the space around it. Passages that should be straight curve back on themselves. Distances become unreliable. I've lost my way 3 times trying to reach the generator since the field activated. Nevertheless, we must try. Holmes turned to me. Watson, return to the surface. Inform Lestrade of what we've discovered and have him prepare for a possible evacuation. If we succeed in dissolving the field, those 15 people will need medical attention and considerable reassurance. You're going in there alone? I protested. Holmes, that's madness. Not alone. With Professor Aldrich to guide me and his knowledge of the technology to assist me. He gripped my shoulder. Trust me, old friend. I've navigated stranger labyrinths than this. I wanted to argue, to insist on accompanying him, but I recognized that expression, the absolute determination of a man whose mind was made up. Very well. But if you're not back in 2 hours, I'm coming after you. Fair enough. Now go, and quickly. We have less than 12 hours before the collapse becomes inevitable. I made my way back through the tunnels, my mind racing. We had found the culprit, discovered the mechanism, and learned how to prevent disaster. But we still didn't know the identity of Aldrich's mysterious patron, the person who had funded this entire catastrophe. And somewhere in the darkness of those tunnels, that person was still free, still dangerous, and still protecting whatever secret those Ravenswood documents contained. I emerged into the night air to find the fog had grown again, now extending into the street itself. The crowd had been pushed back another 20 yards, and I could hear people inside the barrier calling out more frequently, now their voices desperate, frightened. Time was running out. But as I hurried toward Lestrade to deliver Holmes's message, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something crucial. Some piece of the puzzle that would make all the others fall into place. The truth was close now. I could feel it. But would we find it in time? The night had grown cold and damp by the time I finished briefing Inspector Lestrade on Holmes's discoveries. The inspector had immediately mobilized his men, establishing a perimeter around the tunnel entrances and preparing medical assistance for the eventual evacuation of the trapped victims. But as I stood watching the preparations, my thoughts kept returning to the shadowy figure who had escaped our grasp in the tunnels, the person who had funded Aldrich's work and orchestrated this entire catastrophe. Dr. Watson? A soft voice interrupted my reverie. I turned to find Miss Catherine Crosby approaching, her face pale in the lamplight. Has there been any news of my uncle? Holmes has found a way to dissolve the field, I told her, and watched relief flood her features. With luck, your uncle and the others should be freed within hours. Thank God. She swayed slightly, and I quickly offered my arm for support. Forgive me. I've been so worried, and I haven't slept since. Perfectly understandable, Miss Crosby. Perhaps you should return home and rest. I promise to send word the moment we have news. I couldn't possibly sleep, not while Uncle Edmund remains trapped. She steadied herself and withdrew from my support, her composure returning. Doctor, Watson, may I speak with you candidly? About the case? Of course. She drew me aside, away from the constables and the crowd. This afternoon, after you and Mr. Holmes left, I remembered something. Something my uncle said that didn't seem important at the time, but now, go on. It was 2 weeks ago. We were dining together, and he seemed distracted. I asked what troubled him, and he said, "Sometimes the sins of the past reach out to claim the present, Catherine. Sometimes we discover that the people we trust most have been deceiving us all along." Did he elaborate? Numero. I pressed him, but he wouldn't say more. Except, she hesitated. He did mention that he'd recently learned something about a client someone he'd known for years that had shaken his faith in his own judgment. He said it concerned a matter from decades past, something that had been deliberately hidden. This aligned with what Richard Ravenswood had told us, that his father's existence had been erased, that the Ravenswood family had claimed he died abroad. But there was something in Miss Crosby's tone that suggested more. "You have a theory," I observed. "Not a theory exactly, but Uncle Edmund specialized in inheritance law, Dr. Watson. He'd handled the Ravenswood estate's legal affairs for years, since before I was born. If something had been hidden in that family's past, he would have known about it, or should have known." You're suggesting someone deceived him? I'm suggesting that perhaps the documents Richard Ravenswood brought to him weren't the first time Uncle Edmund encountered evidence of Thomas Ravenswood's survival and secret marriage. Perhaps he'd seen such evidence before and had been persuaded to ignore it. The implications were troubling. That would make your uncle complicit in the original deception, or a victim of it. Her voice was firm. My uncle was an honest man, Dr. Watson. If he concealed evidence, it was because he'd been convinced it was false, or because he'd been threatened, or because he trusted someone who betrayed that trust. Before I could respond, a commotion arose from the direction of the fog. The crowd parted to reveal a woman being escorted by two constables, elderly, well-dressed, with the bearing of the aristocracy despite her obvious distress. Inspector Lestrade hurried over. "Lady Pemberton, madam, you shouldn't be here at this hour." "I have every right to be here," she replied sharply. "My son's house number 224 is trapped in that monstrosity. Samuel hasn't emerged, and I demand to know what's being done to rescue him." I recognized the name Samuel Preston, the Bank of England clerk Lestrade had mentioned earlier. But why would his mother be titled as Lady Pemberton rather than Mrs. Preston? Miss Crosby evidently had the same question. "Lady Pemberton? Forgive me, but isn't your son named Samuel Preston?" The elderly woman's face tightened. "Preston was my first husband's name. Samuel kept it after I remarried following his father's death. I am now Lady Pemberton, having married Lord Pemberton 20 years ago." Her voice carried a defensive edge that suggested this explanation had been given many times before. "My apologies, madam," Lestrade said soothingly. "I assure you we're doing everything possible to. Your best isn't good enough." Her composure cracked, revealing the frightened mother beneath the aristocratic facade. "My son is a gentle soul, Inspector. He's never harmed anyone, never been involved in anything untoward. Why would anyone target him?" "We don't believe your son was specifically targeted, Lady Pemberton. The fog affected multiple buildings and..." "Then why these specific buildings? Why my son's home?" She turned to me, perhaps recognizing me as someone less official, more approachable. "You're Dr. Watson, aren't you? I've read of your chronicles. Is Mr. Holmes working on this case?" "He is, madam, and he's confident of resolving it soon. Then perhaps he can explain something to me." Her eyes, sharp despite her age, fixed on mine intently. "Perhaps he can explain why, 3 days ago, a man came to my son's house asking questions about the Ravenswood family." Pause. The name hit me like a physical blow. The Ravenswood family? What sort of questions? Questions about the inheritance, about the old scandal. The man claimed to be a journalist researching aristocratic families, but Samuel didn't believe him. He said the man seemed too intense, too personally invested in the answers. "Did your son describe this man? Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and penetrating eyes." She paused. "Rather like the description Mr. Crosby gave of the man who'd been following him." My mind raced. Could this have been Aldridge? Or perhaps the mysterious figure who'd escaped us in the tunnels? "Lady Pemberton," I said carefully, "why would anyone ask your son about the Ravenswood family? What connection does he have to them?" Connection? She seemed genuinely puzzled. "None whatsoever." That's what made the question so strange. "Samuel knows nothing of the Ravenswoods beyond what anyone might read in old society papers." But even as she spoke, I saw something flicker in her eyes, a moment of hesitation, of uncertainty. She was lying, or at least concealing something. Miss Crosby had seen it too. "Lady Pemberton," she said gently, "my uncle Edmund Crosby was your family's solicitor for many years, wasn't he?" "He was my father's solicitor, yes. A fine man. I was devastated to hear he's been caught up in this nightmare. Then perhaps you can help us. You see, we believe this entire catastrophe relates to documents my uncle possessed, documents concerning the Ravenswood inheritance. If there's anything you know about that family, anything at all that might help us understand who would go to such lengths to suppress those documents." Lady Pemberton's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're suggesting, young lady, but I resent the implication that I'm implying nothing," Miss Crosby said firmly. "I'm simply asking for help in saving 15 people's lives, including your son and my uncle. If you know something, anything, now is the time to speak." For a long moment, Lady Pemberton stood silent, some internal struggle playing out across her aristocratic features. Then, quietly, she said, "Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private." We retreated to the tea shop, now empty save for a tired-looking proprietor who grudgingly agreed to make a fresh pot despite the late hour. Once we were settled in a corner booth, Lady Pemberton began to speak. "I was born Margaret Ravenswood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Youngest daughter of the Earl of Ravenswood. Thomas was my older brother." I felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath me. Thomas Ravenswood? Richard Ravenswood's father? If what this pretender claims is true, yes. Her face was hard now, defensive. "But you must understand, when Thomas disappeared, we had every reason to believe him dead. He'd run off with that vicar's daughter against our father's wishes, vanished without a word. Years passed with no communication, no proof of life. Eventually, our father declared him legally dead so that the inheritance could be properly settled. But he wasn't dead," Miss Crosby said, "so it would appear. Though I never knew it, never suspected." Lady Pemberton's hands trembled as she lifted her teacup. "When this Richard Ravenswood person appeared with his documents claiming to be Thomas's son, I was stunned, furious. How dare he appear after all these years, making claims that would undo decades of settled law? "The inheritance would pass from your family to his," I observed. "It's not about the money," she snapped, then seemed to collect herself. "Or rather, it's not only about the money. It's about justice, about honoring our father's wishes, about everything Thomas threw away when he chose that woman over his family." "Did you know Edmund Crosby was handling Richard Ravenswood's claim?" I asked. "I learned of it recently, yes. Edmund was too ethical to share confidential client information, but word gets around in legal circles." Her gaze dropped. "I may have expressed my displeasure to him, reminded him of his duty to the family who had retained him for decades." "You tried to persuade him not to file the documents," Miss Crosby said, her voice cold. "I asked him to be absolutely certain they were genuine before destroying my family's legacy. Is that so terrible? Did you threaten him?" Lady Pemberton faltered. "I may have mentioned that false claims of inheritance can result in criminal prosecution, that he should be very careful before lending his name to potential fraud. And when he refused to be swayed?" I pressed. "I did nothing." Her voice rose. "I would never harm Edmund Crosby. And I certainly wouldn't create some impossible fog to trap my own son along with him." She had a point. What mother would deliberately endanger her child? Unless— "Lady Pemberton," I said slowly, "where is your husband?" "Lord Pemberton?" She stiffened. "He passed away 6 months ago. My condolences. And his will, how did he leave his estate?" "What does that have to do with anything? Please answer the question." She drew herself up proudly. "Lord Pemberton left everything to me, with provisions for Samuel after my death." "Why?" "And the Ravenswood inheritance, who currently controls it. The trust is managed by the family's designated representatives, of which I am one. But the ultimate beneficiary, assuming Richard Ravenswood's claim fails, would be Vincent Merrick, as my sister's grandson." I exchanged glances with Miss Crosby. The web was more tangled than we'd realized. "Lady Pemberton," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you had any contact with Professor Marcus Aldridge?" Her face went blank. "Who?" a scientist, dismissed from the Royal College 5 years ago, specializes in atmospheric chemistry. I've never heard of him. Her confusion seemed genuine. Why would I have contact with a disgraced scientist? Because someone funded his work. Someone who wanted to prevent the Ravenswood documents from being filed. Someone with motive, means, and access to considerable resources. And you think that was me? She stood abruptly. I may have been angry about this inheritance claim, Dr. Watson, but I am not a monster. My son is trapped in that fog. My brother's old friend is trapped in that fog. Do you honestly believe I would orchestrate such a thing? Before I could respond, Sergeant Hopkins burst into the tea shop. Dr. Watson, you must come immediately. Mr. Holmes has emerged from the tunnels, and he's brought someone with him, someone who was trapped inside the field. We rushed back to find Holmes standing at the barrier's edge, supporting a disheveled young woman who could barely stand. It was Charlotte Red, the librarian, the woman we'd glimpsed through the fog earlier. Charlotte! Her sister Helen rushed forward, embracing her. Thank God! Sister Helen rushed forward, embracing her. Thank God! How did you get out? The fog, Charlotte gasped. It thinned for a moment, near the ground level. I saw an opening and ran. She looked around wildly. But the others there still in there, and there's something wrong. The buildings are changing, shifting. We keep getting lost trying to find the exits. And there's a terrible grinding sound, like reality itself is tearing apart. Music swells. Holmes's face was grim. The collapse has accelerated. Professor Aldrich's calculations were optimistic. We have perhaps 3 hours, no more. Were you able to reach the generator? I asked urgently. Numero. The tunnels near the field center have become completely distorted. We'd need someone who knows them intimately, someone who's navigated them successfully before. He looked at Lady Pemberton, who had followed us out. Madam, I don't believe we've been introduced. This is Lady Pemberton, I said, sister of Thomas Ravenswood and mother of Samuel Preston, one of the trapped victims. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. Indeed? Then perhaps you can help us, madame. Your family's properties in this area, did any of them have access to the old tunnel system? The Ravenswood townhouse, 3 streets from here. My father used the tunnels to transport valuable items between properties discreetly, but that was decades ago. I haven't thought about them in years. Could you navigate them? Could you guide us to the cellars beneath number 222 Baker Street? She hesitated. Perhaps, if my memory serves. But why would I? Because your son's life depends on it, Holmes said bluntly, as do 14 other lives. We need to reach that generator, Lady Pemberton, and you may be our only hope. I watched the conflict play out on her face, pride warring with maternal love, secrets warring with desperation. Finally, she said, very well, I'll try. But Mr. Holmes, I want your word that whatever I say or do in those tunnels remains confidential. There are family matters, old shames. You have my word, provided your secrets don't involve murder or deliberate harm. She nodded slowly. Then let us proceed. Every moment we delay, my son remains in danger. As we prepared to descend once more into the tunnels, I found myself wondering about this unexpected third suspect. Lady Pemberton had motive. The Ravenswood inheritance would enrich her nephew rather than her own son. She had potential knowledge, access to the old tunnels, connections to powerful families. But she also had something the others lacked, genuine distress at her son's imprisonment. Was she a victim, a villain, or something more complex? The answer, I suspected, lay waiting in the darkness below. The Ravenswood townhouse stood empty and shuttered, its windows dark, its once grand facade now shabby with neglect. Lady Pemberton produced a key that looked as old as the building itself, and we entered through a servant's door into what had clearly been the kitchen decades ago. Holmes had assembled our small expedition with care. Himself and myself, Lady Pemberton as guide, Inspector Lestrade representing official authority, and Professor Aldrich carrying the chemical agents needed to dissolve the field. Sergeant Hopkins remained above ground to coordinate the rescue efforts once the field collapsed. The cellar stairs descended into cobweb darkness, the air growing progressively colder as we descended. Lady Pemberton led us through what had once been wine storage, then to a wall that appeared solid until she pressed a particular brick. With a grinding sound, a section of the wall pivoted inward, revealing a passage beyond. "The family's private tunnels," she said quietly. "Built in the last century when discretion in one's comings and goings was considered essential for the nobility." We proceeded in single file, our lanterns creating dancing shadows on the ancient brick walls. Unlike the public tunnels we'd explored earlier, these passages were dry and surprisingly well maintained, suggesting someone had used them more recently than Lady Pemberton admitted. "These tunnels saw regular use until when?" Holmes asked casually. Lady Pemberton didn't answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice carried a heavy burden. "Until my father died 15 years ago. After that, we saw no need to maintain them. Too many memories, too many old sorrows." "What sort of sorrows?" She stopped, turning to face us. In the lamplight, her aristocratic features looked carved from stone. "Mr. Holmes, you asked me to be honest, and I shall be. But first, I need you to understand something about my family. We were not always the reduced circumstances you see now. Once, the Ravenswood name carried real power, real influence, and my father would do anything to protect that power." "Including concealing the truth about his son?" I asked. "Including that, yes." She resumed walking, her voice drifting back to us. "Thomas was his favorite, you see. His heir, his pride. When Thomas ran off with Charlotte Barrett the vicar's daughter, it broke something in father. He raged for weeks, then grew cold and calculating. He sent men to find Thomas, to bring him back." "And did they find him?" Holmes prompted. "They did. Living in Cornwall with his new wife, working as a schoolteacher of all things. Father's men tried to persuade Thomas to return, but he refused. Said he'd found something more valuable than title or wealth. He'd found love and purpose." Her laugh was bitter. "Father couldn't accept that, so he did the next best thing. He made Thomas legally disappear." We had reached a junction, and Lady Pemberton paused to consider our route. "This way," she decided, leading us down the left passage. "Father used his influence to have Thomas declared legally dead, paid off officials, altered records, even created a false grave marker. As far as English law was concerned, Thomas Ravenswood died abroad in 1864. "But he didn't die," Lestrade said. "He lived another 20 years at least, long enough to father Richard." "I didn't know that." Lady Pemberton's voice cracked. "Not until this pretender appeared with his documents. I thought Thomas really had died, that father's fiction had simply formalized the truth. But if he lived," she trailed off, then added more quietly, "if he lived, then father's actions were far worse than I'd imagined." "Who else knew the truth?" Holmes asked. "Edmund Crosby. He was father's solicitor, handled all the legal paperwork for the false death certificate. I suspect he was troubled by it. Edmund was always conscientious, but father could be very persuasive, and very generous to those who served him well." We walked in silence for several moments before I voiced the question troubling me. "Lady Pemberton, if you knew Edmund Crosby helped conceal your brother's survival, why did you allow him to continue managing your family's legal affairs?" "Because I didn't know the full extent of it until recently. I knew father had declared Thomas dead, but I believed that was simply making official what had already occurred. It wasn't until Richard Ravenswood appeared with birth certificates proving Thomas lived until 1884 that I realized the deception ran deeper. And when you learned this—" She stopped again, and when she turned to face us, tears gleamed in her eyes. "I confronted Edmund, demanded he explain how he could have been party to such fraud. He told me he'd been young, ambitious, desperate for the patronage of a powerful family. By the time he understood the full implications of what he'd done, it was too late to undo without destroying both himself and my father." Pause. "He asked me for forgiveness," she continued softly. "Said that when Richard Ravenswood brought him those documents, he saw it as a chance for redemption. A chance to undo the harm he'd helped cause by ensuring the true heir received his rightful inheritance. But you didn't want that," Holmes observed. "Numero. I wanted my father's memory protected, my family's dignity preserved. She shook her head. "I wanted the past to stay buried. But Edmund wouldn't listen. He said some sins must be acknowledged and corrected, regardless of the cost. So you decided to stop him," Lestrade said, his voice hard. "No!" She whirled on the inspector. "I would never harm Edmund Crosby. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I argued with him. But I would never, ever resort to violence or— She gestured vaguely upward, toward where the fog presumably still hung, or whatever madness has created this nightmare. Holmes had been studying the tunnel walls, running his fingers along the brick. These tunnels have seen recent use, Lady Pemberton. Look here, fresh scuff marks, recent disturbance of the dust. Someone has been traveling this route regularly. I told you, I haven't been down here in 15 years. Then who has? He turned to face her directly. These are your family's private passages. Who else has access to them? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, uncertainty crossing her features. I suppose Vincent would have known about them, my nephew. His mother, my sister, would have told him about the tunnels before she died. Vincent Merrick? I said sharply. Yes, and Samuel, of course. My son explored these tunnels as a boy, despite my warnings. She paused. And I suppose Professor Aldrich could have discovered them if he was looking for hidden access to Baker Street. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. We're going in circles, Watson. Everyone is a suspect, and no one is a suspect. Someone funded Aldrich's work. Someone threatened Crosby. Someone activated this field knowing it would trap innocent people. But who? We continued in tense silence until Lady Pemberton announced, "We're close now." The passage should emerge in the old Ravenswood property cellars, which connect to the underground passages beneath Baker Street. We rounded a final corner and found ourselves facing a heavy wooden door. Lady Pemberton reached for the handle, then froze. "It's warm," she whispered. Holmes immediately moved her aside and felt the door himself. Heat from beyond. Significant heat. He turned to Professor Aldrich. "Could this be the generator?" "Possibly. The chemical reactions required to maintain the field would generate considerable thermal energy." Holmes withdrew his revolver. "Everyone stay behind me." He eased the door open carefully. Beyond lay a chamber that must have once been a wine cellar but had been transformed into something altogether different. Chemical apparatus filled the space glass tubes, brass fittings, bubbling liquids that glowed with an eerie blue-green light. At the center stood a device the size of a small carriage, humming with barely contained energy. Heat radiated from it in waves. And slumped beside this device, unconscious or worse, lay a man in a fine suit. "Vincent!" Lady Pemberton rushed forward before anyone could stop her. "Wait!" Holmes shouted, but it was too late. The moment she crossed the threshold, the device's humming changed pitch. The blue-green glow intensified. And somewhere above us we heard the sound Charlotte Reed had described reality itself tearing apart. Professor Aldrich grabbed the doorframe, his face white. "The field! It's collapsing. She's triggered some kind of proximity alarm." Holmes was already moving, dragging Lady Pemberton back from the device. "Aldrich, can you stabilize it?" "I can try." The professor rushed to the apparatus, his fingers flying over controls I couldn't begin to understand. "But, Mr. Holmes, this isn't my design." "Someone has modified it, added components I don't recognize." "Then improvise." Holmes turned to me and Lestrade. "Check Merrick. Determine if he's alive." We hurried to Vincent Merrick's side. He was breathing but unconscious, with a significant wound on the back of his head. "He's been struck from behind," I reported. "Recently, too. This injury is no more than an hour old." "Then he's not our culprit," Holmes said grimly. "He's another victim." Music swells. The humming was growing louder, more urgent. Aldrich worked frantically, pouring chemicals from vials into specific chambers, adjusting valves, muttering calculations under his breath. "How long do we have?" Holmes demanded. "Minutes, maybe less." Aldrich's hands were shaking. "Whoever modified this device knew exactly what they were doing. They've created a feedback loop. Any unauthorized approach triggers an acceleration of the collapse." Holmes spun toward Lady Pemberton. "Who else knew about these tunnels? Who else had the knowledge to modify Aldrich's work?" "I don't know. I swear I don't." A voice from the doorway interrupted her. "She's telling the truth, Mr. Holmes. She knows nothing." We all turned to see a figure standing in the passage behind us, tall, distinguished, with features I recognized even in the dim light. Dr. Elias Pemberton stepped into the chamber, a revolver in his hand. "You?" Holmes breathed. "Aldrich's former colleague." "Former friend," Pemberton corrected sadly. "Though I fear our friendship has led us all to this terrible moment." Professor Aldrich looked up from the device, shock and betrayal warring on his face. "Elias?" But you said you destroyed all our research, you said. I lied, Marcus. I've been lying for 5 years. Pemberton's gun remained steady, covering all of us. The Royal College may have dismissed you, but I continued our work in secret, refined it, perfected it. And when the opportunity arose to put it to practical use, I seized it. What opportunity? I asked, though dread was already forming in my stomach. The Ravenswood inheritance, of course. Pemberton smiled without humor. You see, gentlemen, Lady Pemberton isn't the only one with a connection to that noble family. My late wife, God rest her soul, was Thomas Ravenswood's secret bride, which makes me the stepfather of the true Ravenswood heir. Pause. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Richard Ravenswood is your stepson? Indeed. Though he never knew his father, Thomas died when the boy was barely 5 years old. I married Charlotte shortly thereafter, gave Richard my name and my protection. But I always knew that one day the truth would emerge, that my stepson would claim his rightful inheritance. So you helped him, Holmes said. You arranged for the documents to be brought to Crosby, knowing his conscience would compel him to file them. I did, but I made a miscalculation. Pemberton's expression darkened. I didn't anticipate how desperately certain parties would fight to prevent that filing. Didn't anticipate the threats, the intimidation. When I realized Richard and Edmund Crosby were both in danger, I had to act. By creating an impossible prison, Lestrade's voice shook with fury. By trapping innocent people? By protecting the documents until they could be safely filed. Don't you understand? Once those papers reach the courts, Richard's claim becomes public record. It can't be suppressed or destroyed. The truth becomes unstoppable. He gestured at the humming device. This field was meant to be a temporary vault, a few days at most, just long enough to ensure certain interested parties couldn't interfere. But then everything went wrong. Vincent Merrick, Holmes said, indicating the unconscious man. He discovered your plan. He tracked me here through the tunnels. Clever man, though not clever enough. I had to neutralize him. But in our struggle, he damaged the control mechanisms. Now the field is collapsing ahead of schedule, and I can't stop it. Professor Aldridge looked up from his work, his face grim. Elias, you've created a catastrophe. This device is beyond saving. We need to evacuate the entire area before. The humming suddenly changed pitch, rising to an almost painful frequency. The blue-green glow intensified, and I felt a strange sensation as though the air itself was becoming thicker, harder to breathe. It's accelerating, Aldridge shouted. Everyone out, now. But Pemberton raised his revolver. No one leaves, not until the documents are secure. You madman, Lady Pemberton cried. My son is up there. 15 people are trapped. 16, actually, a new voice said from the doorway. You forgot to count me. We turned to see Richard Ravenswood standing in the passage entrance, his face pale but determined. Behind him stood Sergeant Hopkins and 2 constables. Mr. Ravenswood, Holmes said with evident relief. Your timing is impeccable. I couldn't stay away, Mr. Holmes. Not when I realized. He looked at Pemberton with profound sadness. Not when I realized my stepfather had done all this in my name. Richard, Pemberton's gun wavered. My boy, you don't understand. I did this for you, for your birthright. You imprisoned innocent people. You've created a disaster that could destroy half of Baker Street. Richard stepped forward despite the weapon aimed at him. I never wanted this. I would gladly surrender every penny of the Ravenswood fortune if it would undo what you've done. But it's yours, your father's legacy. I won't let them steal it from you. The device's humming reached a crescendo. Aldridge abandoned his attempts at repair and backed away. It's going to collapse. We have perhaps 60 seconds. Holmes moved with the speed of a striking snake. He crossed the distance to Pemberton in 3 strides and struck the man's wrist sharply, sending the revolver clattering across the stone floor. Everyone out! Move! We scrambled for the doorway as the device began to shake violently. Lestrade and Hopkins grabbed the unconscious Merrick and dragged him toward the passage. Lady Pemberton needed no urging. She ran as though all the demons of hell were at her heels. I looked back to see Holmes and Aldridge at the device, their hands flying over the controls. Holmes, there's no time. We must try, Watson. If we can trigger a controlled collapse. You'll both be killed. Richard Ravenswood grabbed my arm. Doctor, Watson, we must trust them. Come. Music swells intense, urgent. We reached the passage just as a sound like thunder filled the chamber behind us. The blue-green glow flared to blinding intensity. Then suddenly, silence. Complete, absolute silence. I turned back, my heart in my throat, expecting to see the chamber collapsed, Holmes and Aldrich buried in rubble. Instead, I saw both men standing beside the device, which had gone dark and still. The humming had stopped. The glow had faded. "Did you—" I couldn't finish the question. Holmes looked up, his face pale but triumphant. "We triggered an emergency dampening sequence. Professor Aldrich's original design included a fail-safe one that his modifications had obscured but not entirely removed. The field?" Lestrade asked urgently. "Collapsing now, but slowly, gradually. Exactly as we intended from the beginning." Aldrich's hands were shaking. "The building should become visible within minutes. The people inside will be able to simply walk out." We made our way back through the tunnels in a state of exhausted relief. As we emerged into the cellar of the Ravenswood townhouse, we could hear shouting from the street above, cries of amazement and joy. The fog was disappearing. When we reached Baker Street, dawn was breaking over London, and I witnessed a sight I shall never forget. The 6 buildings were gradually materializing, like photographs developing in a chemical bath. First faint outlines, then solid walls, then windows and doors and all the ordinary details of everyday architecture. And from those buildings, people were emerging confused, frightened, but alive, all 15 of them. I saw Edmund Crosby stumble out of his office door, immediately surrounded by constables and medical personnel. Miss Catherine Crosby broke through the police cordon and ran to embrace her uncle, both of them weeping openly. Samuel Preston emerged from number 224, calling for his mother. Lady Pemberton ran to him with surprising speed for a woman of her years, and their reunion was touching to witness. The tobacconist, the librarian, the boarding-house tenant Saul emerged blinking into the morning light, as though awakening from a strange dream. Dr. Pemberton was taken into custody by Inspector Lestrade, though the man offered no resistance. He seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour, all the fight gone out of him. "I only wanted justice for Richard," he said quietly as the constables led him away. "Was that so wrong?" Richard Ravenswood watched him go, tears streaming down his face. "Not the goal," he said softly, "but the method, always the method." 3 days later, Holmes and I sat in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The morning papers spread before us. The miracle of Baker Street had captured the public imagination, with every newspaper offering increasingly fanciful theories about what had occurred. "They're calling it everything from mass hallucination to divine intervention," I remarked, scanning the headlines. "Not one has come close to the truth." "The truth, Watson, would strain credulity far more than any fiction." Holmes set down his pipe and fixed me with that penetrating gaze. "But there's something that's been troubling me, something that doesn't quite fit." "What's that?" "Dr. Pemberton's confession was too convenient, too complete." Dr. Pemberton's confession was too convenient, too complete. He answered every question, explained every mystery, tied every loose thread into a neat bow. Holmes rose and began to pace. "In my experience, real criminals are never so accommodating." "You think he was lying?" "I think he was protecting someone." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, Miss Catherine Crosby, looking considerably more composed than when we'd last seen her. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I hope I'm not intruding," she said as we welcomed her in. "Not at all, Miss Crosby. How is your uncle?" "Recovering well, thank you. The doctors say he suffered no permanent harm from his ordeal, though his memories of the time within the field remain confused." She settled into the chair I offered. "But I'm not here about my uncle. I'm here about Dr. Pemberton." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "Indeed? I visited him in custody yesterday. With my uncle's permission, of course he wanted me to deliver a message of forgiveness, which I did. But while I was there, Dr. Pemberton said something strange. He said, 'Tell Mr. Holmes to look more carefully at the financial records. The truth is hidden in the numbers.'" "Financial records?" I echoed. I assume he meant the records of the Ravenswood estate, though he wouldn't elaborate. She withdrew a folder from her bag. "My uncle gave me these copies of the trust documents he'd been reviewing. He thought they might help." Holmes seized the documents eagerly and spread them across the table. For several minutes, he studied them in silence, his eyes moving rapidly across columns of figures and legal terminology. Then he stopped, his finger resting on one particular entry. "Watson, look at this!" A payment of £5,000 made 6 months ago from the Ravenswood Trust to EP for consulting services. EP, I said. Elias Pemberton? Perhaps, but look at the authorization signature. He turned the document toward me. The signature read, Vincent Merrick, trustee. Merrick paid Pemberton? Miss Crosby said, confused. But why would? Unless he wasn't paying Pemberton at all. Holmes was already reaching for another document. Miss Crosby, does your uncle's firm handle the accounting for the Ravenswood Trust? They did, yes. Though Uncle Edmund expressed concerns about certain irregularities. What sort of irregularities? Payments that seemed excessive, consulting fees that couldn't be properly verified. He mentioned it to Vincent Merrick several times, but Merrick assured him everything was proper. Holmes was sorting through the documents with increasing urgency now. Here, and here, and here. Over the past 5 years, more than £30,000 have been paid from the trust to various consultants, contractors, and service providers, all authorized by Vincent Merrick. Is that unusual? I asked. It's suspicious, Watson, particularly when combined with this. He held up another document. A letter from Merrick to Edmund Crosby, dated 2 months ago, expressing concern about the trust's diminishing capital and suggesting they might need to deny Richard Ravenswood's claim on the grounds of insufficient funds. Pause. Understanding dawned on me. He was looting the trust. Merrick was embezzling from the Ravenswood estate. Precisely. And when Richard Ravenswood appeared with legitimate documents proving his claim, Merrick faced exposure. The courts would demand a full accounting of the trust. His theft would be discovered. Miss Crosby's face had gone pale. So, Merrick created the fog? But Dr. Pemberton confessed. Dr. Pemberton confessed to protect his stepson. He believed, or was led to believe, that Richard had created the field in desperation to preserve the documents. Pemberton took the blame to save the boy he'd raised as his own son. Holmes stood abruptly. Watson, we need to speak with Vincent Merrick immediately. He's still recovering from his injuries, I protested. The blow to his head was self-inflicted, I suspect, a useful detail to deflect suspicion. He was already reaching for his coat. Come, there's not a moment to lose. We found Vincent Merrick at a private hospital in Marylebone, sitting up in bed and looking far healthier than a man with a severe head injury should. His expression when we entered made it clear he'd been expecting us. Mr. Holmes, he said calmly, I wondered how long it would take you to see through Pemberton's confession. You hired Professor Aldrich to create the field, Holmes said without preamble. You funded his research, provided him with equipment and materials, all while embezzling from the trust you were meant to protect. Can you prove that? I can prove the embezzlement quite easily. The rest, Holmes smiled thinly. The rest will follow once we establish your financial connection to Aldrich's work. For a long moment, Merrick simply sat there, his face expressionless. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. You're quite right, of course. All of it. I've been stealing from the Ravenswood estate for 5 years, replacing the money I took from my own failed investments. I thought I'd have time to replace it before anyone noticed. But then that boy appeared with his damned documents, and I knew I was finished. So you decided to prevent the documents from being filed, I said. I decided to make them disappear, along with anyone who'd seen them. The fog field seemed perfect, an impossible phenomenon that would baffle investigators while giving me time to flee the country with what remained of the trust funds. His expression hardened. But Pemberton ruined everything. His modifications to the device, his insistence on eventually releasing the victims was too moral for his own good. You struck him and left him unconscious in the cellar, hoping we'd believe he was another victim, Holmes said. I did, and I would have succeeded if that interfering Richard Ravenswood hadn't arrived when he did. Merrick leaned back against his pillows. Though I suppose it doesn't matter now. You have your confession, Mr. Holmes. I trust you'll see that it's properly recorded? I'll see that justice is properly served, Holmes replied coldly. As we left the hospital, with Merrick in the custody of the constables Holmes had wisely stationed outside, I found myself struggling with the complexities of the case. So Pemberton was innocent after all? Not entirely innocent, Watson. He did provide Merrick with the scientific knowledge needed to create the field, even if he didn't understand the true purpose. But his crime was one of misplaced loyalty and poor judgment, not malicious intent. And Richard Ravenswood will receive his inheritance, though considerably diminished by Merrick's theft. Still, I suspect he'll consider it a fair price for the truth about his father finally being acknowledged. We walked in companionable silence for a while before I asked the question that had been troubling me. "Holmes, how did you know Pemberton was lying to protect Richard?" He smiled. "Because no father, even a stepfather, could speak of his son's supposed crimes with such calm detachment unless he was deliberately crafting a false narrative. Pemberton's confession was too perfect, too detailed. It had the quality of a prepared statement, not a spontaneous admission. He was sacrificing himself to save Richard from suspicion. But Richard was never truly a suspect. Pemberton didn't know that. He saw his stepson as the obvious beneficiary of the crime and assumed we would too. His confession was an act of love, Watson. Misguided, certainly, but motivated by genuine paternal devotion. A week after the resolution of the Baker Street vanishing, I found myself back in our sitting room, attempting to organize my notes into something resembling a coherent narrative. Holmes had been uncharacteristically quiet all morning, sitting by the window with his violin, playing soft, melancholy airs that spoke of cases concluded but not entirely resolved. "You're troubled," I observed. "Merely reflective, Watson." He set down the violin. "We solved the mystery, saved 15 lives, and brought a criminal to justice. By any measure, a successful conclusion. But I find myself thinking about the cost. Dr. Pemberton will likely face criminal charges for his role in the affair, even though his intent was protective rather than malicious. Richard Ravenswood has his inheritance, but has lost the stepfather he clearly loved. And the Ravenswood family's secrets are now public knowledge, bringing shame to Lady Pemberton and her son. Justice often comes with a price," I said gently. "Indeed it does." He rose and retrieved a letter from the mantelpiece. "This arrived this morning, from Edmund Crosby." I read it with interest. Crosby thanked Holmes profusely for his intervention and announced his decision to retire from active practice, turning his firm over to his niece Catherine, who had proven herself more than capable during the crisis. "He's also including a substantial donation to your favorite charity," I noted, seeing the enclosed bank draft, "which I shall accept on behalf of the Orphanage Fund." Holmes gazed out the window at Baker Street, now returned to its normal state of bustling commerce and everyday life. "Do you know what strikes me most about this case, Watson?" "What's that?" "How close we came to complete disaster. If Pemberton hadn't included that failsafe in his original design, if Aldridge hadn't remembered it existed, if we'd been even minutes slower. Aldridge hadn't remembered it existed, if we'd been even minutes slower." He shook his head. 15 people would have died, and dozens more might have been killed in the collapse. The margin between success and catastrophe was terrifyingly narrow. "But we did succeed," I pointed out, "thanks to your deductions and quick thinking. And luck, Watson. Let us not forget luck." He turned from the window with a slight smile, though I prefer to call it the favorable alignment of probability. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson showed in Richard Ravenswood, looking considerably more composed than during our previous encounters. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Ravenswood. Please sit." He settled into a chair, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. "I wanted to thank you both personally for everything you've done, and to inform you of some decisions I've made." "Regarding your inheritance?" Holmes asked. "Regarding everything." Richard drew a deep breath. "I've spoken with my stepfather, Dr. Pemberton. He's deeply remorseful for his role in the affair, even though his intent was to protect me. I've engaged the best solicitors I can find to defend him, and I've told the prosecutors that I'll testify on his behalf." "That's generous of you," I said. "It's the least I can do. He raised me, educated me, gave me everything a father could give a son. I won't abandon him now." He paused. "As for the inheritance, I've decided to share it." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Share it? With whom?" "With Samuel Preston, Lady Pemberton's son, and with any other Ravenswood descendants who can be identified. My father would have wanted his family reunited, not divided by greed and suspicion. The money is less important than the legacy of honesty and integrity. A noble decision, Holmes observed. Though I suspect your stepfather's legal defense will consume a considerable portion of the estate regardless, I'm prepared for that. Richard stood, preparing to leave. Mr. Holmes, may I ask you something? Do you believe Dr. Pemberton is fundamentally a good man who made a terrible mistake, or a criminal who happened to be caught? Holmes considered the question carefully. I believe, Mr. Ravenswood, that morality is rarely so simple. Your stepfather committed serious crimes. He facilitated imprisonment, endangered lives, and obstructed justice. Yet his motive was love for you, and his ultimate actions helped save those he'd endangered. He is neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but rather a complicated man who made complicated choices. That's what I think too. Richard extended his hand. Thank you, gentlemen, for everything. After he departed, I returned to my writing, but Holmes remained standing by the window. You disagree with my assessment? I asked, sensing his mood. Not at all. I merely wonder whether we've truly reached the end of this particular story. He turned to face me. Vincent Merrick embezzled £30,000 over 5 years. We've recovered perhaps half of that from his accounts. Where is the rest, Watson? Spent? Hidden? Or paid to someone else? Someone whose involvement we haven't yet discovered. He tapped his fingers against the windowsill, a gesture I recognized as indicating active thought. Merrick claimed he acted alone in hiring Aldrich and creating the field. But he's a solicitor, Watson, not a scientist. How would he even know such technology existed? How would he know to seek out Aldrich specifically? Perhaps he read about Aldrich's work in academic journals? Possible, but unlikely. Aldrich's research was suppressed by the Royal College. No reputable journal would have published it. He began pacing now, his energy rising. No, Watson, someone pointed Merrick toward Aldrich. Someone who knew about the atmospheric manipulation research and saw how it could be used for criminal purposes. Who? Before he could answer, another knock came at the door. This time, our visitor was Inspector Lestrade, looking grim. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm afraid I bring troubling news. Vincent Merrick has escaped custody, Holmes guessed. Lestrade's eyes widened. How did you guess exactly? Sometime during the night, he was removed from the hospital by persons unknown. The constable on duty was drugged, and when he woke, Merrick was gone. Drugged with what? Holmes asked sharply. The doctor said it was chloral hydrate, administered in his tea. Holmes and I exchanged significant glances. Chloral hydrate, a sedative commonly used in medical practice, but requiring specialized knowledge to dose correctly. Someone with medical training, I said. Or someone with access to medical supplies, Holmes added. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I need you to obtain complete records of all visitors to Merrick during his hospitalization. Every doctor, nurse, delivery person, anyone who might have had access to his room. You think the escape was planned? I think Vincent Merrick had an accomplice we haven't identified. Someone who helped him hire Aldrich, helped him plan the fog field, and has now helped him escape justice. Music swells mysterious, unsettled. But Holmes, I protested, we know the whole story. Merrick confessed to everything. He confessed to his own crimes, Watson. But consider, how did a moderately successful solicitor come to have the connections needed to hire a disgraced scientist and procure illegal equipment? How did he know the precise legal schedules for when Crosby would be filing the Ravenswood documents? How did he arrange for his own injury to be discovered at precisely the right moment to deflect suspicion? Someone was feeding him information, Lestrade said slowly. Someone with access to legal circles, medical knowledge, and scientific connections. Holmes pulled down his index of criminal records and began flipping through it rapidly. Someone who appears in this case but has remained carefully in the background. He stopped at a particular page, his finger resting on an entry. When he looked up, his eyes were alight with the thrill of the hunt. Gentlemen, I believe we need to have a conversation with a certain chemistry professor who has been remarkably helpful throughout this investigation. Dr. Pemberton? I said, confused. But he's in custody, and he was genuinely trying to save his stepson. Nu Watson. Not Elias Pemberton. Holmes grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The other professor who appeared in this case. The one whose name keeps surfacing but who we've never properly investigated. Who? Lestrade demanded. Holmes paused at the door, his expression grave. Professor Marcus Aldridge. We found Professor Aldridge exactly where Holmes predicted he would be, in a small laboratory he'd rented in Southwark, supposedly to continue his legitimate research under the supervision of the Royal College. When we arrived with Lestrade and 3 constables, Aldridge was in the process of packing his equipment. "Mr. Holmes," he said with remarkable calm, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." "Tea? We're not here for social pleasantries, Professor." Holmes entered the laboratory and began examining the equipment. "We're here because I've realized you've been playing a very clever game from the beginning." "Have I?" Aldridge continued packing, seeming unconcerned by our presence. "You helped Vincent Merrick plan the entire affair. You created the fog field on his instructions, modified your own design to include the fail-safe mechanism, and then presented yourself as a victim of Merrick's manipulation. That's quite an accusation, Mr. Holmes. Do you have proof?" "I have logic, Professor. And logic tells me that everything about your supposed victimhood was too convenient. You just happened to be monitoring the field from the tunnels when we found you. You just happened to remember the fail-safe mechanism at the critical moment. You just happened to have the precise chemicals needed to safely collapse the field." Aldridge stopped packing and turned to face us, a slight smile on his face. "Go on. You created this entire scenario as a demonstration of your technology's capabilities. The ransom, the 15 trapped people, the threat of catastrophic collapse, it was all theater designed to prove to potential clients that your atmospheric manipulation technology actually works." Pause. "And it worked brilliantly," Aldridge said softly. "For 6 days, I held 6 buildings hostage using nothing but chemistry and physics. I proved that my research the Royal College dismissed as impossible is not only viable but extraordinarily powerful." "You endangered 15 innocent lives to prove a point?" I said, horrified. "I endangered no one, Dr. Watson. The failsafe was always there. The field was never going to collapse catastrophically. The entire crisis was carefully calculated to appear deadly while remaining completely under my control." "Then why did you need Merrick?" Lestrade demanded. "Because I needed someone to take the legal blame while I demonstrated my genius to the world. Merrick was perfect, a desperate embezzler with motive to commit the crime and no scientific knowledge to dispute my narrative." Aldridge's smile widened. "I approached him 6 months ago, offered him a solution to his financial problems. All he had to do was provide funding and, when the time came, confess to hiring me under false pretenses." "But he didn't confess," Holmes said. "Dr. Pemberton did." "An unexpected complication, but ultimately irrelevant. Pemberton's confession served the same purpose. It directed blame away from me while allowing me to play the role of reluctant hero." "And now?" I asked. "What's your plan now?" Aldridge gestured to his packed equipment. "Now I disappear, taking my proven technology with me. I already have 3 interested buyers, foreign governments willing to pay handsomely for the ability to create impenetrable barriers, to seal off areas during civil unrest, to control populations through fear of the impossible made real." "I can't let you do that," Lestrade said, stepping forward. "Marcus Aldridge, I'm placing you under arrest for—" Aldridge pulled a lever on one of his devices. Immediately, the air around him became thick, visible, a miniature version of the fog that had consumed Baker Street. It formed a sphere approximately 6 feet in diameter, with Aldridge at its center. "You cannot touch me, Inspector," his voice came, muffled but audible. "And I can maintain this barrier for approximately 20 minutes, more than enough time for me to make my escape through the back passage I prepared for precisely this contingency." Holmes stepped toward the barrier, studying it intently. "Ingenious, Professor. But you've made one crucial error." "Have I? Enlighten me." "You assume I came here unprepared." Holmes withdrew a small vial from his coat, a sample I recognized as one he'd collected from the Baker Street fog days ago. "While you were busy congratulating yourself on your cleverness, I was analyzing the chemical composition of your fog, and I discovered something interesting." He uncorked the vial and poured its contents on the barrier's surface. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Where the liquid touched the fog, it began to dissolve, creating gaps in the protective sphere. "No!" Aldridge shouted, but it was too late. The barrier collapsed inward, and Lestrade's constables rushed forward to seize him. As they clapped handcuffs on the struggling professor, Holmes held up the now empty vial. Sodium thiosulfate dissolved in alcohol, a simple neutralizing agent effective against your particular chemical compound. I suspected you'd have one final defense, so I prepared accordingly. Aldrich stared at Holmes with a mixture of fury and grudging admiration. You magnificent bastard! Save your compliments for the doc, Professor. You'll have ample opportunity to explain your genius to the judge. As Lestrade led Aldrich away, the professor called back over his shoulder. You haven't won, Holmes. My technology is real. My designs are documented. Others will continue my work. Perhaps, Holmes replied quietly, but they'll do so knowing the consequences of using it irresponsibly. After Aldrich was secured in the police wagon, Lestrade turned to Holmes with evident respect. How did you know he was the true mastermind? Several factors, Inspector. First, his knowledge of the fog field's mechanisms was too complete for someone allegedly hired under false pretenses. Second, his discovery of the failsafe was too convenient. A real victim would have mentioned such a crucial detail immediately, not remembered it at the perfect dramatic moment. Third, and most tellingly, his equipment purchases began 6 months ago, before Merrick's embezzlement became desperate, before Richard Ravenswood appeared with his documents. Someone was planning this demonstration long before the immediate crisis arose. Aldrich, I breathed. He orchestrated everything from the beginning. Indeed, he found Merrick, identified his vulnerability, and offered him a devil's bargain. He probably even suggested ways for Merrick to embezzle more effectively, knowing that the deeper Merrick sank into crime, the more desperate and controllable he would become. And Pemberton? I asked. A victim of his own loyalty. When he saw the fog and recognized his old research, he immediately assumed Richard must be involved. His confession was genuine. Watson, he truly believed he was saving his stepson from prosecution. Lestrade shook his head wonderingly. A criminal mastermind hiding behind multiple layers of deception, each designed to direct suspicion elsewhere. If you hadn't seen through it, Holmes, he would have escaped to sell his technology to the highest bidder. The highest bidder would have been making a poor investment, Holmes replied. Oh, the technology works well enough on a small scale. But maintaining a field large enough to be militarily useful would require constant supervision, enormous amounts of chemical reagents, and infrastructure that would be immediately visible to aerial reconnaissance. Aldrich's invention is a scientific curiosity, not a practical weapon. But he convinced buyers it was practical? I asked. By creating a spectacular demonstration right here in London. The Baker Street vanishing proved his technology worked. The successful rescue proved it was controllable. Foreign governments would pay millions for such capabilities, never realizing the practical limitations until after they'd parted with their money. So it was all a con, Lestrade said. A monumentally elaborate, scientifically sophisticated confidence scheme, precisely. And like all good cons, it relied on the marks seeing what they wanted to see and believing what they wanted to believe. Holmes smiled thinly. Fortunately, I make it a practice to believe nothing until I've verified it thoroughly. A month after Marcus Aldrich's arrest, I sat in our Baker Street sitting room putting the final touches on my manuscript. Holmes had been unusually quiet for several days, occupied with what he called administrative necessities, ensuring all the loose ends of the case were properly tied and all the victims adequately compensated for their ordeal. I have news, he announced, entering the room with several letters. Richard Ravenswood has officially received his inheritance, what remains of it after Merrick's theft. He's used the first portion to establish a trust fund for the other victims of the fog field, ensuring they're compensated for their suffering. That's generous of him. It's pragmatic. Several victims were considering lawsuits, which would have dragged the matter through courts for years. A quiet settlement serves everyone better. He opened another letter. Dr. Pemberton has been released from custody. The Crown decided his role in the affair was primarily that of a dupe rather than a criminal mastermind. He'll face no charges beyond professional censure from the Royal College. And Vincent Merrick? Still at large, I'm afraid. Aldrich refuses to divulge where he sent him. claiming professional confidentiality even in prison. Holmes set down the letters with a sigh. We can't win them all, Watson. We saved 15 lives and prevented dangerous technology from being sold to foreign powers, I pointed out. That's hardly a failure. True enough. He picked up my manuscript, scanning the pages. You've been writing about the case? Attempting to. It's more complex than most of our adventures. Multiple suspects, multiple deceptions, scientific concepts that strain credibility. You might consider changing some names to protect the innocent, Holmes suggested. Lady Pemberton, for instance, has suffered enough without having her family's shame publicized in the Strand magazine. I was planning to do exactly that. I watched as he continued reading, curious about his reaction. What do you think? Does it capture the essence of the case? It captures the facts admirably, Watson. But I wonder if you've captured the larger truth. What larger truth? Holmes set down the manuscript and moved to the window, gazing out at the street we'd nearly lost. This case wasn't really about inheritance or embezzlement or even scientific genius. It was about the dangers of obsession. Pemberton obsessed with protecting his stepson, Merrick obsessed with covering his crimes, Aldrich obsessed with proving his brilliance regardless of the cost. And what should the lesson be for our readers? That obsession blinds us to consequences, that in pursuing our singular goals, we risk harming those we claim to protect or serve. He turned back to face me. Pemberton nearly destroyed his stepson's future trying to secure it. Merrick endangered his own life trying to preserve his freedom. Aldrich risked his revolutionary discovery trying to profit from it prematurely. Each man so focused on his objective that he couldn't see the precipice ahead. Pause. I added these observations to my notes, recognizing their wisdom. Is there a positive lesson? Something uplifting? Holmes smiled. Tell them that the truth always emerges, Watson. That deception, no matter how elaborate, eventually collapses under the weight of its own complexity, and that there are still those willing to pursue justice even when the pursuit requires descending into tunnels beneath the city or facing down impossible fogs. Shall I make us sound heroic? Make us sound human. That's far more interesting. I returned to my writing, and we sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before Holmes spoke again. Watson, do you believe in impossible things after what we witnessed? I'm not sure what I believe anymore. I've been thinking about Professor Aldrich's technology. Setting aside his criminal applications, the underlying science is remarkable. He truly did create a method for altering atmospheric density, for creating barriers where none should exist, for bending physical space in subtle ways. Are you suggesting his research should be continued? I'm suggesting that impossibility is merely a temporary state. What seems impossible today becomes commonplace tomorrow. Flight, instantaneous communication across vast distances, photographs that capture frozen moments of time, all were once considered impossible. So you think atmospheric manipulation might have legitimate uses? I think every scientific advancement can be used for good or ill. The critical question isn't whether the technology exists, but who controls it and to what purposes they direct it. He turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. The Royal College has impounded Aldrich's notes and equipment. They'll study them in secret, looking for practical applications, while guarding against dangerous ones. In time, his work may lead to genuine benefits, methods for controlling pollution, creating protective barriers during natural disasters, even weather modification. Would Aldrich appreciate that irony? His criminal demonstration leading to legitimate scientific advancement? I suspect he'd claim it was his intention all along. Holmes's smile was wry. Brilliant minds often justify their worst behavior as necessary for their greatest achievements. Is he brilliant? Truly? Undeniably. Evil, certainly. But evil and brilliant are not mutually exclusive, Watson. Some of history's greatest monsters were also extraordinary geniuses. We must acknowledge both aspects while ensuring the genius serves humanity rather than destroying it. I pondered this as I continued writing, trying to capture the case's moral complexities while keeping the narrative entertaining. Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered with the afternoon post. Among the usual correspondence was a cream-colored envelope addressed to Holmes in an elegant feminine hand. He opened it and read silently, his expression unreadable. "News?" I inquired. An invitation to tea from Miss Catherine Crosby. She's formally taking over her uncle's practice and wishes to discuss a potential professional relationship. She occasionally encounters cases that might benefit from my expertise. Will you accept? I think I shall. She impressed me with her composure during the crisis, and having a solicitor who understands my methods could prove useful. He set the invitation aside, though I suspect she has other questions as well. Such as? She has other questions as well. Such as? Such as whether I think her uncle was truly innocent of deliberately hiding evidence about Thomas Ravenswood's survival, whether Edmund Crosby was victim or accomplice in the original deception. What will you tell her? Holmes was quiet for a moment. I'll tell her that her uncle spent the last years of his active career trying to right an old wrong. That whatever mistakes he made in his youth, he attempted to correct them with the time remaining to him, and that his niece has the opportunity to continue that legacy of redemption. That's surprisingly gentle of you. Even I can be gentle when circumstances warrant, Watson, he smiled. Though I'd appreciate you not spreading that observation too widely. It would ruin my reputation for cold rationality. The afternoon sun slanted through our windows, casting familiar shadows across familiar furniture. Below us, Baker Street bustled with ordinary life hansoms passing, vendors calling, pedestrians hurrying about their business. No fog obscured the buildings. No impossible barriers separated reality from itself. Yet I couldn't help feeling that the case had changed something fundamental in how I viewed the world. We had witnessed the impossible made real, seen buildings vanish and reappear, walked through tunnels where space itself behaved strangely. Holmes, I said, do you think we'll encounter something like this again? Another case that defies natural law? He considered the question carefully. I think we've barely scratched the surface of what's possible, Watson. Science advances daily, revealing capabilities our grandparents would have considered magic. Each new discovery opens doors to applications both wonderful and terrible. That's not entirely reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true. He picked up his violin, tuning it absently. But we've proven we can face such challenges, you and I. We can descend into the tunnels beneath London, confront criminal genius, and emerge victorious. That's worth something. It's worth everything, I agreed. He began to play not the melancholy airs from earlier, but something brighter, almost triumphant. It was his way of marking the case's conclusion, of celebrating a victory hard won and lives saved. I returned to my manuscript, determined to capture not just the facts but the feeling of those extraordinary days. Future readers would need to understand what it was like to stand before an impossible fog, to witness buildings vanish and reappear, to face down a genius willing to risk everything for recognition. They would need to understand that even in the rational, scientific world of Sherlock Holmes, room remained for wonder and terror and the occasional miracle. And so concludes the strange case of the vanishing of Baker Street. 15 souls were saved from an impossible prison. 3 criminals were brought to justice. And the truth complex, layered and hard-won, emerged from beneath layers of deception. In the weeks that followed, the fog became something of a legend in London. Some claimed it had been mass hallucination. Others insisted on supernatural intervention. A few whispered about government experiments gone awry. Only a handful knew the truth. That brilliant minds can create terrible wonders, that obsession leads to ruin, and that even the impossible can be explained by those with wit enough to seek the explanation. Sherlock Holmes would go on to solve many more cases, some even stranger than this one. But he would always remember the week Baker Street vanished, and the reminder it provided that the world contains more mysteries than any one man even he could ever fully unravel. Dr. Watson's chronicle of these events would eventually be published, though with names changed to protect the innocent and certain details omitted to preserve national security. It would become one of his most popular tales, prompting letters from readers around the world asking, could such a thing truly happen? To which Holmes, when asked, would reply with characteristic precision, it did happen. Whether it could happen again depends entirely on whether human nature changes, which, in my experience, it does not. The fog field technology remained locked away in the Royal College's secure archives, studied by carefully vetted scientists under strict government oversight. Professor Aldrich died in prison 3 years later, taking many of his secrets to the grave, but leaving enough documentation for others to continue his work more responsibly. Vincent Merrick was never found, though reports placed him in various continental cities over the years. The money he stole was never recovered. Dr. Pemberton reconciled with Richard Ravenswood and lived quietly until his death a decade later. His scientific reputation ruined, but his personal integrity recognized by those who knew the truth. Lady Pemberton and her son remained in London, the family's reduced circumstances accepted with aristocratic grace. She never spoke publicly about her brother Thomas, but she did endow a scholarship in his name for students of modest means seeking education, a small acknowledgement of the man he'd become rather than the heir he'd been. Richard Ravenswood used his inheritance to establish a foundation supporting reconciliation between estranged families, believing that his father's story illustrated the terrible cost of pride and prejudice. And Miss Catherine Crosby did indeed become one of London's most respected solicitors, known for her integrity and her occasional consultations with a certain detective at 221B Baker Street. As for Holmes and Watson, they returned to their familiar routines, cases solved, criminals apprehended, mysteries unraveled. But on foggy London mornings, when mist rolled through Baker Street, obscuring the familiar buildings, Watson would sometimes catch Holmes at the window, watching with an expression of mingled curiosity and caution. For they had learned that fog could be more than mere water vapor, that buildings could be made to vanish, that reality itself was more flexible than most people imagined, and that, in the great city of London, the impossible and the everyday existed in closer proximity than anyone liked to admit.